I've never really been much of a retro gamer. Some of my first gaming experiences were on the Nintendo consoles my parents owned, and they're the ones you'd expect. The original Legend of Zelda, Super Mario World, Town & Country Surf Design's Wood and Water Rage, you know, the classics. They had a small library of games that I played in the early 2000s, and that was really all we had. Once in a while, we'd visit a distant relative that had a Sega console so I could try Sonic the Hedgehog, and when I made friends in school, I learned about the games they had played, things like Metroid and Mega Man. My family skipped over the N64 and got a GameCube in 2002 or 2003, and as time went on, I ended up becoming more familiar with that era of 3D games. And as our library slowly grew from there, I didn't see a need to track down the retro consoles and games that I missed out on, for various reasons ranging from lack of availability or great expense. Hell, I fell behind on the major releases of the era I'm familiar with. Over the years, through digital distribution or collections brought onto more current consoles, it's pretty easy to compile and play a lot of those older titles, some easier than others. So, with such easy access to some of these series that define gaming for a lot of people that I missed out on, I thought it would be fun to finally play some of those for myself. I don't know if this will be a series or anything or how long I'll be doing this, but I thought it would be a fun topic to get this started. Starting with a series I have no nostalgia for, but were influential to some of my current favorite games. Castlevania. I was gonna start with Sonic, but I didn't have all the classic games, and then Sonic Origins got announced when I was writing this, so I held off, which in hindsight kind of worked in my favor. But I did have the Castlevania collections because even though I'm not nostalgic for the series, they're on sale pretty often and for pretty cheap. Published and developed by Konami, the original Castlevania games have you playing as a member of the Belmont family, a lineage of monster hunters that go up against classic horror creatures in the pursuit of defeating arguably the most iconic monster in history, Count Dracula. The first game released in 1986 and has spawned several direct sequels and spin-offs since. I had heard about the series when I was younger, but as I said, I never got to play those original games. So my experience with Castlevania as a series is rather limited, and more focused on some of the odder titles.
This will not make sense to you, but to put it simply, I seek to maintain the flow of a greater will.
The first game in the franchise I played was Curse of Darkness, which I got secondhand from a relative sometime in the late 2000s. It was quite different from what I heard the series was like. I thought we played as someone from a vampire hunting clan. But this guy Hector is a former servant of Dracula, and can summon monsters to fight alongside of him as he hunts down his ally-turned-hated rival, Isaac. I really liked it though, fighting cool monsters and bosses with different weapons and upgrading the devils that followed me, and eventually running into one of those fabled vampire hunters, Trevor Belmont, the first of his clan to defeat Dracula. He looked really cool and had one of the best boss fights in the game. You could even play as him using a code and it just made him stick in my mind even more.
Wait. I have no reason to fight you.
This is your reason. Defend yourself!
But now that I had a taste for vampire blood, I was having trouble finding more games in the series for the consoles I had. The next one I managed to get after reading about it in Nintendo Power was Castlevania Judgment. Even as an unquestioning tween, I realized that mechanically this fighting game was lacking in some places. But I also didn't really care that much, because this was such a great catalog to introduce me to some of the series' most popular characters pulled in from different points in their histories. Well, what about all the fan service? Yes, the fan service was also a reason my 12-year-old self played this a lot, shut up. All the characters had cool designs and powers, and it laid out their personalities and connections to each other in ways not possible otherwise. Like Trevor meeting his descendant Simon Belmont and challenging him to see how the newer generation of hunters is stacking up. Or meeting the younger version of his wife Sypha and challenging her before they even met, while also dealing with the jealous rage of his friend Grant, who had also helped him defeat Dracula. I mean, it is a fighting game, so all these interactions have to end in a battle. Some fights have more justification than others.
They're huge.
Will you stop? These things only get in the way.
How can you say that? Those are a sacred gift!
But there's still a lot of fun meetups and pairings that made their personalities shine through for me. I eventually realized that most of these characters are actually way more interesting here than they are in the games they actually come from. Cornell was one of my favorites here, but he's only been in one game besides Judgment and has been snubbed ever since. And we'll get to Grant's place in the series, and in my heart, later on. Still, Judgment left an impression on me, putting so many characters from throughout the series in my mind. I now realize how ironic this is, because the Castlevania game that had the biggest impact on me has nothing to do with any of those original characters.
We have been deserted by God.
My parents got the family an Xbox 360 in 2012, I think it was, and one of the first games I bought myself for it was Castlevania Lords of Shadow. Well, not myself, because it was rated M, so my dad had to be there to give permission to the GameStop cashier, but you know what I mean. For a few years after I played it, I held up Lords of Shadow as one of my all-time favorite games. Now, just hearing me say that probably made somebody wince or laugh, considering how maligned it was at the time and even now. Despite the very positive critical reception, longtime fans of the series who cared about the original story, characters, and gameplay thoroughly hated this one. 3D Castlevania has been infamously not well received, and Lords of Shadow basically threw all the canon away in favor of something more like God of War and nothing like the other games in its own series. But it kind of blew my mind at the time, and I think that's primarily because it was one of my first gaming experiences on the more powerful end of the 7th generation of consoles. It was about this time when games put a greater focus on grander stories with more cinematic techniques. I was drawn in by the graphics, the brutal combat, and the mythology. I was invested with the main character Gabriel's story, searching for power to revive his wife by hunting down the titular Lords of Shadow who command the monsters that terrorize the land.
I am on desecrated land, and you, and those of your clan, do not deserve to live.
Looking back on it, I can now understand the disdain, but I've still got a soft spot for Lords of Shadow that maybe I should explore in another video. Those are primarily my experience with Castlevania as a series. I have played some of the other titles more recently, like Symphony of the Night and Order of Ecclesia, but those took on different design philosophies around more exploration and teamed up with Metroid to bring us the not very helpful term of Metroidvania. But I don't really have any experience with the original style of Castlevania game, side-scrolling action adventures that are more linear with more limited movesets. Many of my favorite gaming YouTubers have done videos on classic Castlevania, and oftentimes those springboard into talking about the difficulty and how its ideas eventually inspired other genres and some of my current favorite games, like Hollow Knight and Dark Souls.
Pretty much the entire success of the Dark Souls games and all their derivatives is due to the same trick, pairing vaguely spooky surroundings with hyper-difficult gameplay in order to create more than just one type of fear.
So experiencing the roots of the series firsthand could be enlightening in some ways, and I can do that through the re-release collections. There are 14 games across these sets with different design philosophies. Adventure and Belmont's Revenge that follow the original game style on the Game Boy, GBA games like Circle of the Moon and Aria of Sorrow that focus on exploration to find powers and new equipment like Symphony of the Night, Kid Dracula, which oddly reminds me of Kawa. Does anyone else remember Kawa? That short manga by Akira Toriyama about monster kids getting up to hijinks? That would make a fun, goofy anime. Where's Pai-Fu and Jose's cameo in Dragon Ball? Anyways, I'm going to focus on the main numbered titles across the various collections. Castlevania 1 through 4 on the Anniversary Collection, Rondo of Blood, which is effectively considered Castlevania 5 on the Castlevania Requiem set, and since I'm already taking a look at Rondo, I'll take a peek at its re-release Dracula X on the Advance Collection. Maybe I'll look at the other games in these collections in more depth later on, but for now, the core games in the series before the Metroidvania shift seems like enough. This should be a fun retrospective coming from someone who's only now properly digging his teeth into these games. This one goes out to the YouTubers that inspired me to start my channel and attempt to make a video like this. With all that being said, I think it's time to begin the hunt. This is my retrospective of classic Castlevania. Big surprise, we're starting with the first Castlevania game, released in 1986 in Japan for the Famicom, and released in North America a year later for the NES. In Transylvania, the vampire Dracula has been resurrected once again. Last time this happened, a man named Christopher Belmont hunted him down and ended his reign of terror. Christopher is actually who you play as in the Game Boy games released a few years later. As far as the Prince of Darkness's current resurrection, it's now up to Christopher's son, Simon Belmont, to bury him once again. As we approach the front door to certain doom, we have a chance to get used to the controls. We can jump, we can crack our whip straight forward, and that's it. Good luck. Just jump and whip yourself to victory. Jump and whip. To navigate the different sections of Dracula's castle, you have to fight your way through hordes of monsters and platform across precarious pathways and terrifying traps. The whip has an ever so slight delay when you attack, so when you go to strike an enemy, you need to account for that very brief wind-up, needing to wait for enemies to come into your path at just the right time, or carefully closing the distance yourself so you can land your hit. You can't make adjustments in air after a jump, so you have to make sure you're positioned right so the jump arc you commit to lands you where you want to be, and taking damage of any kind not only lowers your health, but also knocks you backwards. There are 18 stages broken up into 6 blocks of 3. The third stage of a block has a boss battle to cap it off, and if you lose a life, you're sent back to the beginning of the stage you were on. But if you've lost all of your lives, you're sent back to the beginning of the level. You have to survive making very few mistakes along the way, so a mistimed attack or wayward jump can domino you into a world worse position or send you off the edge of a platform to your death. There's an odd sense of dread you get from playing Castlevania. It's not a horror game, but it instills a sense of fear in you by making death punishing, and by throwing classic monsters at you that you've probably read about in mythology or seen as antagonists in movies. Dracula is the obvious one, being the blood-sucking king of the creatures of the dark, but he has a diverse army of horrors under his command, ranging from simple beasts like bats and birds, to more dangerous things like fishmen that burst out of the water and spit fire if you don't kill them quickly enough, living suits of armor that throw axes that boomerang back to their cold metal hands, decapitated heads of gorgons that bob up and down as they fly across the screen, usually accompanying another enemy type or in the most tense platforming sections. Even the Grim Reaper knows his place and falls in line under the Impaler. So what makes you think that you're able to face down the most famous monsters in history? Well, because I'm a monster hunter. Killing you is the reason I'm here. And I'm not leaving till you're all back in your graves. Or, failing that, making sure there's nothing left of your body to even entomb. The whip I wield is called the Vampire Killer, and I'll be damned if it's not used to kill a vampire tonight. You may be pushing against a tide of teeth and claws, but you are all you'll need to topple the terrors of the night. But it wouldn't hurt to arm yourself with some better equipment. And luckily, there's the perfect monster slaying tools hiding in the sundries. Breaking candles drop various items, but the most important ones are the chain upgrades, the sub-weapons, and the hearts. Chains upgrade your whip to the Morning Star, initially dealing more damage, and a second chain caps it off, increasing its range. You're almost never without the fully upgraded whip, because no matter where you start in a level, either the first couple candles will drop at least one chain, and the second is either just a little farther ahead, or can even drop from an enemy. The whip may have some reach, but you still have the delay and you can only attack in one direction. That's where the sub-weapons come in to make up for your shortcomings in attack and movement. Throwing items like the dagger that fires straight ahead, or the cross that boomerangs back to you. The axe, which is thrown in a large arc that's hard to aim, but does a lot of damage when it hits. Holy water that is gently tossed, and leaves a lingering flame that can stun enemies so you can follow up with your whip. And the stopwatch, which freezes almost any enemy for a few seconds, leaving them open to attack. You consume hearts you've collected to use these items, so you have to use them sparingly to get the ideal effectiveness. And if you're lucky while flailing around, you might break down a wall and discover some poultry that you can eat to regain some health. These are hidden throughout and can be a relief to find, giving you that bit of extra strength to keep going. I suppose when you're desperate, meat that's covered in brick dust and probably touched by dead things is better than nothing. Little does Dracula know that his minions are probably the ones hiding these pieces of meat throughout the castle, because even though these monsters probably subsist on delicious raw human flesh, sometimes they just need a cooked meal to get their fix. There are other items you can pick up, but they don't really do much. A potion that gives you very brief invulnerability, but usually in places you don't need it. Double and triple shots, which let you spam your items more, which is useful, but rare and only works with the items you have when you pick them up. So, switching items means you lose it, and it doesn't affect the stopwatch at all. And bags that give you more points. But, who cares about points? Yeah, enough points can net you an extra life, but if you're stuck on a stage, you're not going to be able to get enough to get that extra life unless you put yourself in more danger of losing one.
At this rate, you'll be using to continue by stage 2.
Yeah, but I have the most points.
Who gives a shit about points? This guy thinks he's Billy Mitchell.
And you need to save what health and retries you have for the boss at the end of each block, because while you've been fighting and getting hurt by the fodder, they've been waiting for you at full strength. Their health bar is directly under yours the whole time, so every time you peek to see how much damage you've taken from a hit, you're looking at a reminder of every mistake you've made that'll put you at a greater disadvantage when you finally come against the boss. You may be a competent monster hunter, but there's still tension from taking damage or picking up an item that's not great for the current situation. All the progress you make in a level is lost if you fail too many times, and that can get really frustrating to start a block over again. But going through a level again and again, you can start making improvements to your approach. Using a different sub-weapon that's more useful in certain spots, or using them sparingly to save them up for more difficult sections. Learning the timing of enemy attacks so you can avoid them and keep your health and lives for when you really need them. Early on, it was a little tough getting used to the stiff controls, but once I got it, it was actually pretty fun. Jumping over Medusa heads or smacking one in midair, using the right item at the right time to not risk more danger, timing the whip at the perfect moment to take out multiple enemies. I may not have played classic Castlevania, but over the years I played plenty of other games that were inspired by it or directly imitated the style, so I was picking up on the rhythm quickly. I got halfway through the game in less than 30 minutes with only needing one continue, because I got cocky when making some jumps or mistimed a trap. I was feeling pretty confident in my abilities. Then the second half of the game kicked my teeth in. The latter half throws so much at you. I don't want to admit how many times I died because of this one bat at the beginning of stage 10. Moving platforms that make you crouch under stalactites that were indistinguishable from the background, and when you get to the platform in the middle and think you're safe for a moment, the fishman can climb through the ceiling. That's just the beginning. Stage 11 is a straight path, but birds will airdrop fleamen on you that you can't outrun, and just keep coming. Then to end the block, it's another straight corridor with these skeletal snakes that take forever to kill even with a fully upgraded whip. And finally we get to the boss, Frankenstein's monster, teamed up with another one of those jumpy pests that now shoots fireballs. I thought this was like the mummies where both enemies shared the health bar, but no, it's just the big guy in the back. Wasted a lot of retries before realizing that attacking that oversized tick was only stunning him and not doing damage. Apparently that's Igor. Ah, that makes sense now. After multiple continues making very little progress on the actual boss, I finally gave in and resorted to using the save states that are a part of the Anniversary Collection. With how many times I had to start from the beginning of the block, each time I got a little better, getting down the enemy patterns and getting farther with more health and lives. But even taking one hit right before the boss was a huge disadvantage, and I was dying too quickly to get a strategy down. So after 30 minutes of no real progress, I set a save state right at the door to the boss. Even with this ideal setup, it still took over a dozen tries for me to finally pull this off. Alright, finally past block 4. And this was the easiest of the last 3 sections. This pattern persisted through the rest of the game. Block 5 had enemies that would go off screen and then come back again. The Axemen were doing their thing and throwing axes at men, and they were teamed up with other enemy types getting in the way and would block the boomerang cross. And stage 15 was the worst because the final hallway had constantly spawning Medusa heads and 2 Axemen. And after all of that, you come up against Death himself, who spawns scythes that surround you and come back almost as fast as you destroy them. And all of these enemies take a quarter of your health with even the slightest graze, so the amount of mistakes you can make is minimal for the entire block. Once again, I learned the patterns and timed things right in order to make it to the boss without taking a hit, and made a save state right there so I could actually figure out how to dance with Death. Even after going through all the work to play the stage almost perfectly right up until the boss, Death was an existential dread taking cheap shots and lingering over my head. The boss was pretty tough too. After feeding Death his own concept, we finally make it to the 6th and final block, which has its annoyances but isn't as tough as the last couple of stages. Until we get to stage 18, where we finally come face to fangs with Count Dracula. This boss is cool, but really frustrating until you figure it out. You die in 4 hits as he shotguns fireballs at you, and he can teleport right where you're standing. He only takes damage from his head, and even when you have a fully upgraded Morningstar, you only do 1 point of damage per hit. You can use Holy Water to stop some of the fireballs or the cross to get in some damage from afar, but no matter what, it's a long fight where timing is everything. And even after you literally knock his block off, he then transforms into a roided out bat crocodile thing, and now you have to deal with this all new form without even a wall chicken to stress eat. Luckily, if you game over here, you start back at the beginning of the stage as opposed to the start of the block, so you can just keep getting impaled over and over again. After an hour of near constant attempts, I finally pulled it off, timing my jumps to avoid the fireballs while still getting a hit in, and then on the second phase using Holy Water to damage and stun him, and then getting in my lashes right into his oversized eyes. The stars aligned and it was finally over. Simon Belmont has put Dracula back to rest. And as the castle falls, peace is restored to the land. After finishing the game, you're brought back to the start in hard mode, where enemies are more abundant and stronger. I did not feel the need to go through it like this, so for now, this quest is complete. First time through the original Castlevania was pretty fun, even if it was incredibly frustrating in the second half. After beating it once, I could take a step back and appreciate some of the parts that really annoyed me, like the final Dracula fight. It's really intimidating and tests you more than any other part of the game. This first game isn't completely fair all the time, I'd argue, but it is manageable if you put in the time to get down the enemy placement and patterns. I could have gone through this the first time without the save states, but just using them cut down the amount of retries so I could actually figure everything out. I decided to do a second playthrough to see if I could do any better, but then I realized something about the Anniversary Collection I was playing. Added later as part of a free update, there's the option to play the Japanese regional version of most of the games in the collection. In the first one's case, the Famicom re-release version from 1993. It's the same game, but with very slight differences in the presentation, mainly an alternate title screen and the Belmont name being spelled Belmondo. But the biggest difference is that there's an easier difficulty option. You start the game with 9 lives and more hearts, you keep sub-weapons after death, enemies deal less damage, and you don't take knockback from getting hit. Yeah, with all the punishments for being reckless taken away, you can just blaze through the game. In this case, I finished it the second time through in 30 minutes without even using a continue. Yes, the challenge can be fun in its own right, but it was also fun and cathartic to purge Dracula and his minions with ease. But because I was allowed to make more mistakes, I did take my time at some parts to learn how to deal with the enemies better and learn more of the boss patterns. So when I came back around for my third playthrough, I didn't need to rely on the save states to get through it. Still had to continue a bunch of times, but I was more confident now, and it didn't take me long to break through those walls. The first Castlevania game is still really good. It inspired some of my favorite games decades later, and even though I've only just played it for the first time, it felt familiar in a weird way. Again, there are some really hard bits that I could have handled the first time if I just took my time, but this is only the first game we're talking about, and I barely have the free time to do this now, so we're moving on. Simon's next adventure is the one I'm most intrigued by, and the one I'm most worried about. Released a year after the first game, Castlevania 2 follows up on the adventure of Simon after he defeated Dracula. Instead of progressing through stages that mainly navigate straight through to the end, you're put into an open world with multiple paths. A day and night cycle that changes the world and has the hordes of monsters that wander the land grow stronger at night. In order to fight them, you need to upgrade your gear, but instead of breaking candles to collect sub-weapons and whip upgrades, you now have to buy them with your collected hearts from villagers in the various towns. It had positive reception at the time, but decades later it was looked back on in a far more negative light.
This game sucks.
Arguably one of the most influential gaming videos in the early years of YouTube was James Rolfe's video of Simon's Quest that laid out the most common complaints and annoyances the game is known for. This was the very first episode of the Angry Video Game Nerd, inspiring people across the years to make their own videos talking about video games on YouTube, including more negative thoughts about Castlevania 2 from the likes of Some Call Me Johnny and Aaron Ego Raptor Hansen.
As a person who was inspired by the likes of James Rolfe, it feels a bit odd having to review this game.
So I know the Angry Video Game Nerd made a video about Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, and I love him and that video, but I don't give a fuck!
Chances are you've already seen those videos, or at least something talking about Castlevania 2, and more often than not, they tend to lean towards the negative. Kind of like other NES sequels at the time, like Zelda 2 and Mario 2, that were very different from their first games that made them successful. Even if the ideas were the same, the overall execution was jarring and often frustrating to some people. Mario 2 less so in this comparison, but Simon's Quest is in some weird ways more comparable to the adventure of Link than the first Castlevania game, which to some might be part of the problem. Now I actually really like Zelda 2. I only properly finished it recently, and I will not deny that it is hair-pullingly difficult in usually unfair ways, and the minimal direction makes trying to find the way towards progress obtuse and time-consuming, and it really encourages you to keep a guide on hand. But how it feels to fight the various enemies can feel really cool, positioning your shield to block attacks to then go on the offensive. And the elements of the plot actually build up to an exciting story, about Link being hunted by the minions of Ganon, and needing to truly prove himself worthy of wielding the Triforce of Courage. So I'm actually kind of excited to see if I can find that same kind of enjoyment with Simon's Quest. Maybe I can see past the glaring issues to come away from this more positively. Peace seemed to be restored for a while after Simon's battle with Dracula at the end of the first game, but after 7 years, the wounds he suffered from that fight still haven't healed. He learns from a mysterious woman that there's actually a curse placed on him that will shortly finish him off, and it seems like the only way to cleanse this curse is to pull a reverse Belmont, and by that I mean collect the body parts of Dracula and resurrect the vampire lord himself, and then turn that carriage right around and slay him again immediately after. With not much time left, Simon sets out to find the scattered pieces of his greatest foe, and heads face first into danger by invading the hideouts of the Dark Minions, protecting the appendages of their master. Now that's a really cool premise actually. In the first game, you were cautiously storming the gates to hunt down your quarry. In Simon's Quest, you're directionless, confused on what to do with what feels like limited time to thwart Dracula's unseen gambit. The Monster Slayer is forced to risk himself and everyone else to bring back the world's greatest evil. But if he doesn't do it now, there will be no one left to stop Dracula when he inevitably returns. So Simon has to power walk straight into enemy territory with no knowledge of the dangers that lie inside, or what he'll need to subvert the magical machinations and undead underlings ahead. All the while, the cursed wounds that ravage his body flare up during the night, making him more susceptible to the dangers of Transylvania. I realize that's me doing a lot of legwork putting all these pieces together and putting a flowery spin on it, but the melodrama this invokes is very compelling to me. It's a different feeling from the first game where the stakes feel higher and more treacherous. At least, the premise is good. But in the end, the actual game needs to do that justice. And this is where the changes to the style come into play. Our adventure begins in a town, and the first person you can talk to tells you to buy a white crystal. Is that code for meth? I don't think drugs are going to make the night creatures less terrifying, probably would make them more so. We find the shopkeeper that sells the white crystal and we have to pay him in hearts, which now act as a currency on top of ammo for some items. A heart-based economy? I mean, I can only assume that they're going to be eating well for the next few days with all those hearts we were trading them, and not because they're being traded for other goods. We start the game with 50 hearts, so we can buy the crystal right away. Maybe someone else in town will sell us a pipe that'll go along with this ice. We talk to the other townsfolk and they say some weird stuff, like a potion will destroy the wall of evil, and that some guy who owns a boat really likes garlic. These people really must be tripping on the crystal that guy sells because they're all talking about food and walls having sentience. We find 2 more shopkeepers inside some of the buildings. One offers us holy water, which, based on the behavior of the rest of the town, must be spiked, and the other offers us a whip with thorns, probably so we can flagellate ourselves in repentance after our bender. Okay, enough with the drug jokes. In all seriousness, now we have to leave town and start looking for the pieces of Dracula. Simon plays pretty much the same as he did in the first game, but it feels a little better actually. The crack of the whip feels crunchier and killing enemies has more effects to it. We start with some basic horrors, spooky scary skeletons, floppy fishmen, and some wandering werewolves. Enemies are tougher, but it's kind of fun to wail on them repeatedly until they pop. Monsters have a chance to drop hearts, which as stated earlier are a form of currency now, so you need to collect enough to buy what you need to get. But they also give you experience points in order to level up. The amount of XP you get depends on the size of the heart you collect, and when you get enough to level up, your health increases and so does your overall defense, making it harder for you to lose that brand new health of yours. Sounds pretty useful, but based on what I've read, apparently your level caps in certain areas until you make it farther in the game. So in the first section you can get up to the first level, but you have to be in a completely different area in order to get experience for level 2, and so on. So if you want to get your first level up or have the hearts to buy the Thorn Whip and Holy Water before the first mansion, you need to farm for some hearts. This leads to multiple issues as you now have to repetitively slay hordes of monsters over and over again and hope they drop their organs when they die. But when it transitions to night while you're on the hunt, enemies get stronger, and while the rewards are boosted, so is the danger. And if you have all you need to buy that sweet new gear, you now have to wait until the sun comes up before you can spend those hearts, because you can't enter doors in towns during the night. Apparently each day and night cycle is about 3 minutes of real time when you're outside. Time doesn't advance while you're in buildings. But nighttime feels so much longer when you're monotonously whipping zombies outside the church waiting to get blessed with some health. Conversely, daytime feels so much shorter when you're running around town getting odd advice from the villagers and trying to find where that one merchant was before the night falls, otherwise you have to wait around again. And if you lose all your lives, you lose all your hearts and experience too. So if that happens, you need to grind all over again. You don't necessarily need to get every item in order to progress, but some are secretly necessary and will eventually lead to new items later on. Right away, the most important items are the white crystal and the holy water so you can navigate the first mansion. Mansions act as the dungeons across the game, where you often run into new kinds of monsters, and do platforming challenges in order to find the orb that contains the piece of Dracula. In order to get it, you need to find a merchant inside the mansion who will sell you an oak stake that can break the orb and unveil the item. You can equip 2 items at the same time. Passive items like the crystal to reveal invisible platforms in the first mansion, and the pieces of Dracula have their own various effects to either help you in combat or be used situationally to reach new areas. And then the active items like the holy water and other weapons like the daggers and the oak stakes. Holy water doesn't cost any hearts to use, so you can toss them infinitely. The other items cost 1 to 3 hearts to use, and I actually didn't realize this until I was spamming the diamond, and then it stopped working and I realized I had no hearts to buy the oak stake I needed. Whoops. So long as you're not using these items recklessly, they can be very useful for dealing with certain kinds of enemies. There's also additional items you can buy later on to give you temporary effects. Laurels make you invulnerable for a few seconds and can be used to deal with some of the stronger monsters, but it's best to be used in the swamps you need to cross to get to new areas. They slow you down and damage you if you're not using them. And garlic, which apparently makes enemies weaker for a bit. Not what I use them for, but we'll get to that. The holy water may be infinite, but it's also weak and doesn't get any stronger. Instead, what the holy water is good for is finding incorporeal platforms and destroying walls. This is apparently what that villager meant by a potion can destroy walls of evil. Tossing a jug of holy water and watching it fall through the floor is actually kind of neat. However, there's no distinction between the real blocks and the fake ones. So you're immediately trained to toss holy water down every single stretch of stone and every wall you come across, which gets really annoying really quickly. and that poor direction does organically lead you to try tossing holy water in empty shops in order to find shopkeepers that can be essential for the items you need. Inside mansions, you'll probably try breaking walls in hopes of finding some sweet wall chicken, only to find tomes with more unhelpful obscure hints. I would rather eat gravelly chicken than read these books. And unhelpful advice is kind of the main crux of the problem with Simon's Quest, because the translation is a mess. For whatever reason, when the game was being translated to English, the text was heavily altered from the original Japanese meaning. Some of the text is simple and straightforward enough, like the transition from night to day and the white crystal tip at the beginning, but more often than not, the things villagers tell you are so oddly written you can't really glean what they're trying to say. Going back to the holy water, the hint is a potion will destroy walls of evil, but holy water isn't really a potion, and the so-called walls of evil are just generic, indistinguishable walls inside actual domains of evil. And in the middle of towns, apparently. Maybe the villagers are getting these bricks from Satan Emporium, which, let's be real, is basically any major hardware store in America. And we're in the middle of Europe. These people had to go out of their way to get these low-grade materials that crumble at the slightest hint of water damage. Point being, at least I wouldn't have figured out how to use the holy water to find secrets and items if I hadn't already seen the AVGN video telling me to do just that. You could stumble upon that on your own, and once you do, there's no risk to cleansing every brick you see just in case, but again, it gets really annoying splashing your liquid across every floor and wall you see. Once I started doing that, I eventually found the tomes, which you can gather are the 13 clues of Dracula's riddle, which mainly try to point you in the direction of overworld secrets. But unless you're operating on the same moon logic as the people who translated this, you might not get much out of them. I found the Sacred Flame because I figured an odd formation of blocks at the bottom of the rune probably must be hiding something important. But the clue you get leading you to it is a flame flickers in the Ring of Fire. There is neither a flicker nor a ring of fire in this lightless cave full of monster eyeballs. There's a website called Simon's Quest Dissected, which compiles all the text in the game, comparing the Japanese and English text, and gives you detailed interpretations of what the text was supposed to mean. In the Sacred Flame's case, apparently the original Japanese text roughly meant to say that the flame rests in a place with no sunlight. I'm loosely paraphrasing, but even though that's still cryptic, that's a much better clue than the one we got. A lot of the text is like this, and apparently in the game's manual, you were even told that some villagers will just straight up lie to you. The boatman apparently loves garlic, but don't bother dropping any for him because it does nothing. Do you like it or not? And the villagers that don't give advice just say some really weird things. Like this guy who just tells you the name of his favorite movie, and another tells you to not look at the Death Star. Where are you guys learning about this stuff? According to the Dissected website, this is not actually a Star Wars reference. It is more likely a Fist of the North Star reference.
お前はもう死んでいる。何？
I mean, that must have been really obscure for Western audiences back in the day, but it still doesn't help you here, and when you get these seemingly random things told to you on top of the obscure advice, it just feels like more useless text clogging things up. The very few good hints are covered up by the bad ones, and some of the worst ones do make sense if you already know what the solution is. Trying to figure out what the game is trying to tell you on your own can lead to lots of wasted time running around and hitting dead ends, unless you have some certain items equipped at the right time or do certain actions to open new paths. Someone telling you to hit your head on Deborah Cliff to make a hole is not the proper way to tell you you need to equip the red crystal and crouch next to a specific wall for 5 straight seconds, so you can get whisked away by a tornado to where you need to be. And I'm sure I'm not making things easier by not mentioning the names of towns and the manors, but I genuinely keep getting them mixed up even with the guide, so I'm just not even gonna bother. The palette is different now, and I came here from another screen with a particular enemy right next to the transition point. That's what I'm going off of. The thing is, when you know about the most annoying and cryptic aspects of the game, it's actually not that bad. From watching videos like the AVGN review, I knew what to look for and how to use my items accordingly. Use holy water to find the pass-through blocks and break down walls in empty buildings to find the secret shopkeepers, which kept my gear up to date. Drop garlic in a cemetery to make someone appear to get the silver knife. And if it worked once, when you find another cemetery, you do it again and get the same result, getting a silk bag that allows you to carry more laurels. And the logic of, if it worked once, it must work again, helped me figure out the things I didn't know about. I knew about the crouching with the red crystal at the wall, so maybe doing that at other dead ends will yield results. And it did, when I came across this body of water with no way to cross. I decided to just try the theory, and it worked, opening up the main path. provided it works when you have the blue crystal equipped, which you can get from talking to this guy, who is apparently a fellow vampire hunter, and you get the red one later on in the form of another hunter just like him. I got these items naturally just because I was being thorough and talking to everyone in towns anyways, but I didn't need their help because I already knew what they were trying to say. Simon's quest was actually a very smooth ride because I already knew the solutions to the problems people had with the game. I didn't get stuck or waste any time on any obscure sections, and from there it was pretty easy. Losing lives or needing to continue isn't so bad because you're brought back pretty much right where you were. Not like Zelda 2, which sent you back to the first room of the game, which was the worst thing it did to you. It's annoying to lose your hearts and experience, but if you bought what you needed already, you'll pretty naturally build back up again so you can get what you need at the next town. I was going to be sneaky and use save states when I was low on health just in case I died, but I didn't even need to revert a save because I had been back and forth so many times. I knew how to deal with the enemies on the path safely or quickly because my gear was upgraded. I didn't mind that there was no delicious wall chicken to eat in the dungeons because I really didn't need it. I'd swing by the church if I could, but if I wasn't worried about the hearts I had, dying wasn't a grueling punishment. I also knew not to waste the oak stakes on the enemies because it just does nothing. They're the keys you need in order to find the pieces of Dracula at the end of the mansions, and equipping those in place of the crystal give you some passive abilities. The first one you get is the rib, and it's the best one because it gives you a shield that blocks projectiles if you stand still. The other parts have abilities too, but they're just not as good as the rib. The heart doesn't do anything except you have to equip it and then talk to the ferryman so he'll bring you to another mansion. The eyes let you see where secrets are, which would be useful if the hints were actually useful. The nail lets your whip break blocks like the holy water, but it's not really helpful because you get it so late in the game, and it's just not as flexible as the holy water because of its throw arc. And the ring does nothing. You just need it to finish the game. The idea of using Dracula's organs and body parts as buffs is a really great idea, but it's ironically not fleshed out enough. And that's where most of my issues with the game lie. The good ideas are usually let down by poor execution. The world has some great moments of looping back to familiar places after long amounts of exploring, but you'll go through the same places a lot, and the scenery gets really repetitive. A lot of the enemies are pretty simple, so it can get tedious to fight them the same way over and over again. My favorite enemy in the game are these bone-throwing skeletons that leave a flame where its projectiles land, but it's near the end of the game where you should be completely stacked. I like the mansions that act as dungeons. They're the most visually distinct, with some puzzle solving to the platforming and enemies. But again, you'll be tossing holy water around constantly so you don't fall through the floor, and there are some platforming sections that are too tight for the rigid controls. And there are no real challenges in the manners to test your skills and or equipment, because there are only 3 bosses in the game, and they're all near the end. Death makes his ghoulish return, but his bones must still ache from the last time we fought because he's a complete pushover this time around. You can even completely ignore him and run right past and get the Dracula part without even fighting, but if you do fight him, he drops the gold knife when killed, which could be the best weapon in the game, as it has range, does damage on impact, and then does more damage by leaving a lingering flame. Then in the last manor, there's this floating mask thing, which is apparently the first appearance of Carmilla. Man, went from nobody to some really good looking ones. You can just equip the rib and block her projectiles, then lash her when she spins around the room. You could run right by her as well, but you need to take her down in order to get the cross, which you need in order to open the final path to Dracula's castle, where this journey is about to come to an end. With the rosary in hand, along with the rest of Dracula's relics, we can walk into the castle, which is completely barren. Only a few flights of stairs and jumps to make before you find the room where Dracula can be resurrected. There's often complaints about this, but I honestly kind of like the quiet leading up to the end. There are no dark minions gathered here because you beat them to the punch. They haven't had time to organize here because you already broke into their houses, killed them, and made off with what they were going to bring to Dracula's reunion party. Simon walks through the ruins of the evil domain he destroyed not too long ago. He's about to finish his quest of undercutting the forces of evil by resurrecting Dracula in a gambit to rid himself of this horrible curse. That being said, just because you catch Dracula off guard and immediately attack him after his rebirth, doesn't mean he should be this easy. Like the other bosses, there's not much of a fight to be had here. I was trying not to cheese this fight, but it was more annoying than exciting as he copies himself and spins around the room, with there really being no safe place to avoid getting damaged by the whatever it is he's tossing around. Dying here also sends you back to the entrance of the castle, which has got to be the worst checkpoint in the game, as you have to trudge all the way back to that room to try again. There's the famous AVGN method to end this fight quickly by spamming the sacred flame as soon as you can, so the burning columns stun-lock Dracula in place till he burns to death. I decided to not do that, and I thought I was being clever by throwing the gold daggers to get some damage in before he disappeared, but that turned out to be an even faster kill. He may have just woken up, but Dracula gets put back to bed very quickly. As soon as Dracula explodes, that's the end of the game, and it changes depending on how many in-game days passed. On my first playthrough, I finished it in just under 14 days, which means I got the middle ending, where Simon succumbs to his wounds during the fight and dies. That's a downer ending for the middle ground. We can check the other ones by typing in some annoying passwords and starting the game with some equipment collected as we make our way back to Dracula's castle and finish him off again. The bad ending for beating the game in 15 days or more may have a darker palette, but the text is way more uplifting about Simon's triumph. And finally, the best ending looks more somber, and the text isn't as joyful as the bad ending. Considering the translation of the rest of the game, I wouldn't be surprised if maybe these endings are actually jumbled up as well. The best ending also has a hand bursting out of Dracula's grave, which seems like it should be bad, but in a way, it's probably considered good, because if Dracula's return is imminent, it means there's another game on the way. Although it's a little odd in hindsight, since the next game is a prequel, and this would be Simon's last adventure in canon. So maybe Dracula's laying low for a while so we can give Richter a pestering. Castlevania 2 has some aspects I really like, and even though I'm pushing a lot of personal headcanon onto the story, it did get me invested in Simon's plight. People say that the text boxes that appear during the day and night transitions are from some invisible narrator, but I assume they were coming from Simon, grumbling stoically as he bemoans the sunless sky. It wasn't the monsters that grew stronger during the night, Simon was growing weaker, as his body became racked by the curse that was empowered by the darkness, just like the one who cast it. And when the sun rises the next day, it's a sigh of relief because the pain has subsided, if only for a few hours. Again, that is just me sensationalizing the few plot beats we got, but it made me feel cool as I battled tough creatures with a flaming whip in the dead of night, so hey, that's something at least. The vagueness of the clues because of the translation is what really holds the game back though. Having little direction is fine, but when the information the game tells you is inaccurate or even just wrong, you can argue the game did a poor job of teaching you how to solve the problems it gives you. And while I didn't have any issue, it's only because I already knew the solutions from years of YouTube videos ripping this game to shreds.
Castlevania 2's cheap lastability is easily identifiable because it falls flat in so many areas, aka it sucks!
Maybe unfairly in some cases. But don't get me wrong, I am not trying to lambast these great videos. My hindsight was heavily informed by them. It was ironically because of those videos I actually came away liking some of what Simon's quest was trying to do. Looping around to a familiar area after extended exploration gave me the same excitement from finding a shortcut in Dark Souls, because it was interesting to see a blip of cohesion in the world. The openness means you can do things in different orders if you want to risk the dangers or know where to go to get the items you need, kind of like Metroidvania games such as Symphony of the Night. You can see how Simon's quest was setting down the bricks of Metroidvania games as we know them. Unfortunately, it had also fell through a translucent block it had laid down. And after seeing Castlevania 2 fall through it, everyone else knew how to avoid stepping in that particular spot. This is Simon's last adventure as far as the series timeline goes, but it's not the last we'll see of him here. Our next quest, however, will take us back even before his father's time, where the Belmont of that era made some unlikely allies. Yet another year later, the follow-up to Simon's quest was Castlevania 3: Dracula's Curse. This, however, takes place before the first game, and even before Christopher's time when his first game was released on the Game Boy months prior. Dracula is terrorizing the land as him and his night creatures do, and we're playing as the first Belmont who was able to put him down. My man, Trevor Belmont.
God shoots in my dinner once again.
But he didn't do it alone, as along the way he recruits other monster slayers to help him out. Grant Dynasty, a thief who wants to avenge his family, Sypha Belnades, a hunter from the church who uses magic. Their gender is kept ambiguous in this game, but you probably already know that she's a she, so we'll move on from there. And finally Alucard, the son of Dracula who actually wants to put a stop to his father's reign of terror. This game introduces so many characters that will become essential to the games that come after it. As I mentioned before, Trevor left an impression on me from playing Curse of Darkness, because he was so cool and touted as the strongest Belmont for being the first to slay Dracula. Grant and Sypha were some of my favorite characters in Judgment from their designs and movesets, and Grant's jealousy of Trevor for marrying Sypha is one of the most fleshed out subplots across the different stories in that game. And Alucard even before those games starred in Symphony of the Night, being able to use many different weapons and abilities in what many consider the best game in the series. And all these characters take center stage in the great Netflix series, where it's grandly fleshing out the base premise of the game, where they team up to face Dracula and his vampire allies. Except for Grant, who didn't show up in the series.
Between the wandering packs of night creatures and the brigands and opportunistic criminals, and that one guy with the horse-drawn sailboat on wheels that called himself the Pirate of the Roads.
I'll be honest, I was bummed about that since I liked him so much in Judgment, but he's very different there than he is in the first game, and there were already so many characters and plot threads going on in that show, he'd probably just get in the way.
I trust this isn't a bolder breed of brigand, or that imbecile who put wheels on his boat again.
Even Lords of Shadow, which is a completely separate canon, has Trevor and Alucard in it, and they're the same person.
And God shits in my dinner once again.
All these characters that have had massive influence across the franchise or left a mark on players' minds even in spin-offs first appeared in Dracula's Curse. But despite that, it seems to be the least talked about game in the classic lineup. I've watched a bunch of videos talking about the first game and how it established the series, Simon's Quest on how it changed things and was often derided for it, and Super Castlevania 4 on how the series jumped to the SNES. But it seems people tend to skip over the third game.
But the question that I think is really important here isn't whether or not this is better than Castlevania 1 or 2, or whatever the fuck one comes between the second and fourth ones.
Now maybe I just happened to miss them, but it seems like even more obscure titles in the series get more attention than Castlevania 3. Was it simply forgettable? Or was it just fine, but didn't garner a lot of attention because it got caught in the middle of the series' most influential titles? Well, let's arm pump towards Dracula's castle as Trevor and see if we can find the answer. We start Trevor's quest and it's an immediate return to form of the first game. Trevor plays pretty much exactly as Simon did. Same jump arc, the slight delay on the whip, and the same chain upgrades and sub-weapons you get from breaking candles. It feels about as good as the first game, except it's better here solely because we're playing as Trevor Ralph Belmont. I forgot that in the original Japanese version his name is actually Ralph. Anyways, things feel just like the first game, but it's after the first level where things start to deviate. There are a few times where you can choose which path to go down, leading you to different groups of levels. Some levels have more than 3 stages that make up the block, and some bosses show up well before the end. Along the way, depending on your path, you'll find the other characters that offer to go with Trevor, bringing their own unique abilities to the cause. You can only have one companion at a time, and they share a health bar and hearts as you swap between them. You can also choose for Trevor to go it alone, if you're too scared to let people into your life, or if you think a vampire hunter teaming up with a vampire is a bad idea.
He shouldn't die. Yes, fuck you.
The earliest companion you can meet is Grant Dynasty in the Clock Tower, where he's been corrupted by Dracula and is the boss of the level. He's a pirate who wants to avenge his family, and he'll put his sneaky skills to use. He attacks with a very short-range knife and can only use bladed sub-weapons and the stopwatch, but he makes up for his lack of offense by being very mobile. He's got the highest jump of the cast and can even adjust his jump arc in midair, a series first. He's also able to climb walls and ceilings, allowing you to go over the enemy's heads and squeeze through gaps if you're positioned right. It's a bit finicky to control though, because you need to hold the direction towards the surface you're on while you're trying to move, which led to many deaths because I let my thumb up or slipped off the D-pad while scaling ceilings. I ended up using the analog stick when playing as Grant because I felt like I had more control when making slight adjustments while moving. Halfway through Block 3, you get another split path, and both lead you to another partner. The top path leads you to Sypha, who is freed after you kill a Cyclops boss at the end of the level. Oh, that's actually referenced in the show, I didn't realize that until I played this. They offer their aid, and we bring her along, leaving Grant behind. And that's oddly fitting for the series. When playing as Sypha, all sub-weapons turn into spells that she alone can use, and they are devastating in almost any situation. A fire stream that's about as long as the whip and does heavy damage, a multi-directional explosion of ice which can freeze enemies and even their projectiles for a few seconds. You can then use them as platforms or take them out with one smack of Sypha's whacking stick. This staff is actually more useful than you think. It may be low damage and short range, but it swings very fast, and I found using Sypha's attack was more reliable than anyone else's to knock projectiles out of the air and stun lock enemies to death. And then there's the lightning spell, which fires orbs that can semi-home in on enemies and hit multiple times. Precision is not needed with this because even if it only hits once, the lightning can melt enemies and bosses' health bars away. It's so powerful I even had this glitch where the lightning killed this devil boss while he was off screen, and the orb to end the level never dropped.
Sypha broke it.
I did not.
You kind of did.
I do not break things.
So we agreed she broke it.
Oh yes.
All these spells are devastating and they only cost a single heart. Sypha may take more damage from being hit, but give her some space and she becomes the best character, just like in the Netflix show.
Oh no! Night creatures! Whatever shall I do?
Finally, there's Alucard if you took the bottom path from earlier. He's a boss fight himself, testing you to see if you're really strong enough to take on his father. His basic attack is this low damage orb, but he's the only partner who can pick up chain upgrades like Trevor can. Fully upgraded, his attack turns into a shotgun blast that may be weak, but it covers a lot of area. He can't pick up sub-weapons, but what he can do instead is turn into a bat that you can use to bypass a lot of hazards and enemies. It drains hearts by the second though, so you need a lot to get far with it, and it could drain your resources if you switch back to Trevor. But another benefit in Alucard's favor is that all pickups turn into hearts, so you can stock up quickly. The level from taking Alucard's path have you going underground in order to end up in Dracula's castle. Trevor can also reject all of their help and go try to slay the Vampire King solo, which would be badass if he pulled it off, but having friends help him out with their own special abilities is so much more fun, and a lot easier than doing things by himself. Making your way through the colorful and varied locales from ghost ships, underground tombs, and the somewhat familiar grounds of the castle, which is just as dangerous as ever. So having someone who can fly or climb right over the fodder's stupid heads or blow them away with powerful magic is very useful. Swapping between whoever is in the duo at the time to make sure they get the equipment they need, like the Morning Star for Trevor or the Lightning Spell for Sypha, and using whose moveset would be best for the current situation or boss. With all these abilities at our disposal, it seems like this is going to be a pretty easy adventure. No. No. This game is brutal, and your friends can't save you. This was definitely the hardest game in the classic lineup for me. The first game has a tough second half, but it's doable. It's Simon going after a freshly revived Dracula with his family's experience behind him. Simon's quest isn't actually that difficult because of the forgiving checkpointing, and knowing what you're doing can keep your gear up to date. Attacking the dark forces while they're weak and scattered and getting the jump on Dracula. Castlevania 3 though, you're going up against Dracula's hordes at their earliest and biggest. The Cape Creep has had so much time to grow his forces that they come at you in frightful numbers. There are so many enemies arranged in such weird ways all across the land that even preparing yourself won't be enough. You really want to hunt Dracula and be the first to slay him? Then you're gonna work for it, you lowly mortal! Platforming is tighter than ever here, and usually you're being harried by something. Medusa heads flying around while you're trying to platform on gears, which is a really cool effect, but it's very easy to slip off of them while you're trying to get into a good position to jump. Floating platforms where you have to go very quickly at the right time, otherwise they'll go off screen while you're still on them. Aqueducts that push you back as fishmen pop out and birds swoop in. The longer you push against the current, the bigger the problem gets. Blocks that will break under you on a very slow auto-scrolling section filled with more Medusa heads. A lot of Medusa heads really, but worst of all, you have to climb so many sets of stairs in this game. Navigating stairs has been annoying in the other games, but here it's so much worse. Trevor is the only character who can even attack on stairs. Everyone else is unable to do anything. Enemies will hang out at the tops of the flights and not move out of the way, so there's no way to avoid taking damage. Sometimes the screen transition puts you in the middle of an ambush or another perilous situation that you need to know about ahead of time in order to avoid taking damage. But even if you're prepared, it often doesn't matter. And then there's the parts where multiple layers of dragon cannons are being fired at you while you're on stairs, while more enemies fly in from off screen. There is so much going on here. How are you supposed to deal with this? Yes, I'm sure someone out there has a video of them getting through this without taking any damage, but if I pretend they don't exist, I can continue to be annoyed by this. The first few levels are pretty manageable, but from Block 4 onwards, they get so long and throw so many things at you. Dracula's curse must be that he destroyed most of the checkpoints in the world, because multiple screens can go by, and it still only makes up one stage in a block. And at the end of some stages, you have to fight 2 or even 3 bosses back to back. One chance to take on 3 bosses, and dying sends you back much farther than you'd think. And if you game over, you're sent back to the beginning of the block. But that feels so much more punishing here because the levels are so much longer and harder to get through. Enemy damage scales with the level, so in the last couple, every hit takes a quarter of your health. And then having multiple boss fights to deal with makes your margin for error for the entire block so much less than in the first game. Taking Dracula in the first game as an example, even if you lose all your lives on that last stage, you start back at the bottom of the stairs right next to him. In 3, however, losing a life to Dracula brings you back to the start of the stage with skeletons to deal with and pendulum platforming to do just to take another crack at it. And a game over brings you to the start of the block, which isn't overall very long, but it's still absurdly brutal to set you back that far. I felt a little bad using save states in the first game for the second half, but once I got through it, I went back and didn't need them. I feel no remorse for spamming the quick save after almost every obstacle in Castlevania 3. Even if I had to figure out how to fight a boss trio with only 2 hits and almost no hearts, I'd rather bash my head against that wall than start completely over. It's absolutely possible to get through without needing to save scum. People have done it. I just don't want to, otherwise I'll be stuck here for hours. Now don't forget, we do have friends to help us out here, and they can do a lot to mitigate the difficulty throughout. Sypha can use ice to freeze the aqueducts, making them far easier to traverse. Setting her up with the right magic at the right time can completely destroy a boss, so long as you position yourself in a good spot to avoid damage. Grant can jump or climb over enemies and is shorter than everyone else, so he can more reliably duck under certain attacks. And as long as you have the hearts, you can use Alucard to completely fly over some of the most annoying parts I brought up, but you can still only have one companion at a time, so those pros come with the cons, like Grant and Alucard's lackluster offensive abilities. Like the first game, the Famicom version is much easier in comparison. Enemy damage is consistent throughout and doesn't scale with the level. Grant's basic attack becomes a throwing dagger, which may not seem like much, but it's a huge improvement. The range mixed with his acrobatics is far more useful than his piddly shank, making Grant better overall. The majority of the differences are in presentation. The intro and ending texts are all in Japanese as you'd expect, but you're really not missing much with how poorly written the translation is. Flea men are replaced with these toothy things, which honestly I think are way cooler, and most famously, the difference in the music between the consoles. Famicom cartridges had a bit more space for audio channels, so the same songs sound much grander and epic, having more things going on in the mix. This is definitely the better version of the game to play, for the music and being overall much more fair if I'm being honest. Now, despite my whinging about the difficulty, there are some other things I really like about this sequel. The levels may be stuffed with night creatures and more stairwells than the Empire State Building, but every level looks really good. There's a bit of repetition in the boss fights. You'll run into 3 Cyclopses if you want to recruit Sypha, but there are some returning bosses and even some subversions on some bosses from the first game. Mummies are a cool throwback, even though they're repeated a bunch too. Frankenstein's monster returns, and even though he's much easier here, it's still different from his first iteration. On Alucard's path, you get to fight the giant bat again, but now it splits apart as you damage it, and the actual fight with Alucard is like an easier version of the first Dracula boss. There's lots of similarities, but the original bosses are cool too. The doppelganger near the end is a very clever boss. It turns into whoever you're playing as, and even shares some of your upgrades that you have at the time. It copies your strength, but also your weaknesses, so you can use your familiarity with the gameplay to trick your double into a bad position. And then there's the big man himself, who is a lot easier than in the first form we knew him in, despite that he has 3 forms now. The first form has him summoning pillars of fire that can box you in, and then a third one pops up underneath your feet before he teleports away. Just don't get too close to him so the pillars don't cave in on you, and not too far away where you're too far to hit him. And if you can, go the third pillar in a spot where you can avoid it. The second form is... okay, I don't even know what this is supposed to be. It's just a floating pile of faces spitting up their own confusion. It looks like it moves predictably, but it can be a bit erratic. So try to follow its trajectory and make sure you can safely pass underneath it when you can, so you don't get trapped in a corner and pop the faces like zits. Then the third and final form is an evil Chozo statue. Maybe this is supposed to be like a Baphomet statue or something, but they had to keep the satanic imagery low, so they made it bird-like. I don't know, just an assumption. You just have to hit its head by riding the floating platforms to get you in range while avoiding these massive and hard to avoid lasers. This is probably the hardest part solely because the platforms are small and easy to fall off of directly into the holes they left behind while you try to get your hits in. Jumping to land a hit only to fall into one of those holes killed me more times than even those annoying lasers. Use everything you got and eventually Dracula will fall, and so will Castlevania. Depending on who you had with you, if anyone at all, you'll get a different ending, which doesn't change much. Just different text based on the character as they look out on the new horizon. Trevor alone simply disappears, hoping that one day in the future, his name will be respected.
I'm Trevor Belmont, of the House of Belmont, and dying has never frightened me.
With Grant, he simply cheers and goes off to help rebuild the destroyed countryside.
So slow. That moss I see growing on you?
Alucard feels guilt over killing his own father, and Trevor does pick up on this, but doesn't seem to do much to comfort him.
You're a cockwart, Alucard.
And with Sypha, as the castle falls, her hood goes back, and you see her hair unfurl. It's very much like the reveal at the end of the original Metroid that was released 3 years prior to this, but it's still cool. As Trevor and Sypha cuddle up on the cliffside, and seemingly decide to stick together.
Belnades and Belmont.
Castlevania 3 follows up on the design philosophy of the first game, for better and for worse. The stages look great and have more detailed backgrounds, and the partner system expands on the gameplay with unique abilities for each character. And these characters have been influential and lastingly popular in the franchise. Most of them anyways. You'll always be special to me, Grant. But the difficulty is ramped up so absurdly that getting through it can be really exhausting. Maybe that egregious spike in difficulty is one of the reasons Dracula's Curse gets overlooked in comparison to the others. Despite its good qualities, it's inaccessible, and repetitive enough where when compared to the others it's sandwiched between, there's just less interesting things to talk about here. The third main installment of this franchise took things to the beginning, and the next one will do the same in a different way. The next one I'm taking a look at is one of the most beloved in the franchise, Super Castlevania 4, released in 1991 as the first game in the series on the Super Nintendo. This jump into the future on new hardware decides to go back in time to Simon's first journey, acting as a remake of the first game, reimagining the trek across Transylvania just to get to Casterly. Updated graphics, updated gameplay, new enemies, and bigger bosses than ever. It's Castlevania Supercharged, as the title would imply. This is the game in the classic lineup I was most familiar with before starting this video, because I was hanging out with a friend one time and he got me to play through a few levels in the middle of 2015. And I remember that so specifically because when we were done with that, we stayed up all night playing Batman Arkham Knight, which I had picked up only a few days prior. I wasn't that far yet, so we started a new game and played it for like 12 or 15 hours straight. But we had to stop and he left right as we were walking up to the final story mission. We lost a lot of time doing all the Deathstroke bases, hoping to get an awesome boss fight, only for that to not happen. Man, I loved this game when it came out, but my feelings have gotten really complicated since. Video for another day maybe, but for now, back to Castlevania 4. I did enjoy what I played at the time, and I did pick it up on my Wii U Virtual Console, but I just never got back to it. So let's give Simon's First Hunt a redo and see how it fares. The main thing that sticks out is the graphical upgrade from jumping to a new console generation. Doubling the amount of bits makes a huge difference, as Simon and the minions of Dracula are so much more detailed. Simon not only looks better with his features more defined, but he also looks massive compared to how he looked in the other games. Same goes with the enemies, making them come off as more threatening because you don't expect Medusa heads to look that big and wriggly. Enemies have more movements and are more expressive, making them look cooler. Some look a bit goofy, but when everything looks so good, that's minor.
And this is Jeremy, your only form of hellish entertainment.
Dude, if you do that again, I'm gonna punch you. I'm not kidding.
Simon has grunts and yells from taking damage, so every hit feels more painful, and most enemies have death cries, making their ends more impactful. The levels hit along some of the same beats as the other games. Undead-riddled courtyards, wet subterranean caves, spinning gears of clock towers, and of course, the grand halls of Dracula's castle. But the color and backgrounds make all the levels feel fresh and different, passing through flowing water as it comes through more leaks in the wall. The way the sky moves when you're outside, books shaking in the library making you think they're about to pop out to read you a permanent bedtime story. There are some really cool backgrounds like the spinning cylinder in Block 4, which is awesome but also a bit rough on the eyes. The aesthetics are the best looking in the series yet, and all that's complemented by the familiar but slightly tweaked gameplay. We still have the same mechanics we're used to when playing as a Belmont, the exact same sub-weapons we know how to use, and Simon can still jump and whip. Same main moveset, but now with some slight changes that make a big difference. You can now adjust your momentum in midair, like you could with Grant in the last game. Finally, the Belmont clan has learned the secrets of defying Newton's law of motion and are passing it down to future generations. They also must have finally learned basic geometry because Simon can now attack at angles. Being able to attack straight up or diagonally is already a big change, but that's on top of the attack delay feeling non-existent, so you can rapid-fire whip enemies into oblivion. And then there's my favorite new use of the famous vampire killing weapon, the floppy whip. If you hold the attack button, Simon just keeps his arm out as the whip just dangles limply in the breeze. From there, you can just wave it around, and while it's hilarious to watch Simon flap his flaccid flogger around, you can still hit enemies like this. It does much less damage this way, but it can still stun enemies when it hits, and it can kind of be used to correct missed shots by waving it around in their faces. I am fully aware how suboptimal this is when you could just make another full attack, and to some people, it just looks too silly to be taken seriously, and I completely understand. But you can still use the floppy whip as a shield to stop projectiles, and it works well against weaker enemies. And while this is a personal thing, I couldn't help but laugh every single time I cast out the whip like it was a fishing lure and waited for something to walk into it and explode. I got endless amusement doing this, especially when the catch posed no threat whatsoever. With how big everything looks with the graphical upgrade, it also makes the whip feel at least a little stronger because the Morningstar has even more reach. And like the other games, you're very rarely without it because it's so easy to get chain upgrades, especially with how many more candles there are throughout the levels. Between the speed and flexibility of your main form of offense, the whip is just so much more versatile and useful in this game. With that all being said though, that leads us into one of the bigger complaints about this entry. The whip is so strong now that it de-emphasizes the importance of the sub-weapons. Before, if you were trying to safely hit an enemy that was above you, you could lob an axe, but you had to get used to the throw arc so you could properly aim it. it. Now your whip is more efficient for hitting enemies at those awkward angles. If you needed to hit an enemy that was low to the ground or stun it for a second so you could attack, you could underhand some holy water on them. Now you can either whack them diagonally while you're in the air to keep up your momentum, or just dangle your family heirlooms in front of them until they pop. Even the stopwatch isn't really necessary anymore. Since it's so much easier to dispatch enemies now, you don't need to freeze them to give you a second to breathe. The sub-weapons are not really making up for your shortcomings like they did in the previous games. They are still useful, of course. The boomerang cross is great against bosses, especially if you can get the double or triple shot. And because the need to rely on them is lessened, you can just hoard your hearts and then pour out all your love on the bosses, making the fights much easier. Sub-weapons are also now bound to a bumper button, which is actually very nice, so you can more seamlessly use them as opposed to trying to hold up on the D-pad and attack while you're either jumping or in the middle of another situation. The 1-2 combo of the whip's flexibility and the lessened need to use sub-weapons made this the easiest game in the series for me, but it was also the most fun by a landslide. The feel of the gameplay is so smooth and quick, it makes you feel like a more confident monster hunter than ever. Other seemingly minor changes make a big difference to keep the flow going. Stairs are no longer a hassle because you're not just a sitting duck while you're on them now. With the multi-directional whip and sub-weapons having a dedicated button, you can now clear your path without risk of taking damage by walking into an enemy that's stuck at the top of the flight. You can now jump onto stairs and even drop right through them so they're not so cumbersome to navigate. Even approaching stairs leading into bottomless pits aren't potential death traps now, because you can crouch walk onto them. No more accidentally walking off the edge because it apparently didn't register my pressing down to get on the stairs. The better feel of the movement helps the platforming as well, as you hop around and connect your whip to rings so you can swing across gaps and clear out enemies on your forward path. It just feels so much better as the game keeps you moving. There are some platforms where it's a little tight, like you need to perform a perfect jump at the right time to just barely make it. And I did use save states in a few parts, but they were some of the more annoying areas where, frankly, I don't think some of these deaths were my fault. Like near the end of the game at the Tower of Fiends. These stairs fall apart the instant you get on them, and there were several times where Simon just got caught on a step as he was going up. Or there's this one spot where your head hits a platform and you can miss the stairs with no way to continue if you mess it up. Even when you're better stairs, you're still the worst. Or the level 8 dungeon where it's filled with platforms that have instant kill spikes on them and can kill you if you bump into the side of them. There are some annoying parts like that every now and then, but it was much more manageable and oftentimes more fair than in the previous titles. Accumulating points actually kind of mattered to me this time around, because the levels were long enough with so many enemies and candles that extra lives were easier to get. If I needed to replay a block, it was easier to get an extra life to help me out when I needed it. And since the whip can do the heavy lifting for the sub-weapons, you can just save up your hearts and get a huge point bonus at the end of a level. There's also a few secret rooms where you can get tons of hearts and usually one of the better sub-weapons. While there's only a few of these gold mines, they're a great find. I was elated to find the one in level 6 by complete accident, and had a big smile on my face as I stocked up on hearts and found a better tool for the mission. And then I got upset when I killed this dead guy's ghost dog and he grieved himself away. This is the same level where a bunch of enemies are ghosts in formal attire, and the boss is a couple dancing. We just crashed their date and most likely damned their souls to be alone, separated from their beloved for the rest of their afterlife. Maybe man is the true monster.
Angel, angel, what have I done?
Then again, their boss is out to destroy / eat and or enslave the world, so no sympathy for these traitors.
Actually, we were just dancing.
Speaking of the other bosses, they are also some of the best we've seen in the series yet. A lot of familiar characters with new movesets, like Frankenstein's monster who throws beakers to do damage and create copies of himself, the mummy who now comes alone and faces you on a clock tower as he moves around the different sections of it. There are some repeated motifs, mostly from Castlevania 3, but they are also different enough between their design and new details that they are so much better here. The gold bat is like the other bat bosses, but it's a lot harder to kill, and it explodes gold when you land a hit. So when it splits apart, it becomes more dangerous to attack and cause multiple bursts at once. The stone golem fights just like Frankenstein's monster did in Dracula's Curse, lobbing blocks and raining them down on you, and he gets smaller and faster after every hit. The two-headed water dragon, where each mouth has a specific attack. Most of the other bosses that I didn't mention are knights with some easy-to-read attacks, or others we've seen before. But none of them are as frustrating as we've seen them in previous iterations because of our whip, and some of them can be absolutely destroyed by spamming sub-weapons with all the hearts you've saved up. But if those bosses feel too much like pushovers, the boss rush right before Dracula will give you a proper hassle grueling, as you have to face off against Slagra, Gaibon, and Death in succession. Slagra is the hardest of the trio and probably one of the harder bosses in the game, as he moves so quickly and has long range with his spear and beak. The hitboxes seem really awkward, and as soon as you land a hit on him, he flies straight up and comes right back down, lifting his spear up to stab you. Then eventually he goes all beak and lunges forward as he lands. I eventually figured out I could crouch under his spear attacks and use the pedestals on the ends of the arena to make space between me and his lunges. Apparently this is the ideal way of doing this fight, and I just stumbled upon it. The other two are a cakewalk in comparison, as Gaibon can hit hard but is a lot easier to follow as he flies around, and Death does his usual thing of throwing mini sights at you, but then tops it off with pulling you towards him while puppeteering his big one. These are some of the tougher bosses in the game still, but luckily you don't have to face them all in one shot. On a continue, you're put right by the boss you died to, so at least the checkpoints are nice. Finally, after taking down the strongest of Dracula's flunkies, we're up to the big man himself.
We meet again. Only this time, for the first time.
Not counting Simon's quest, this is probably the easiest Dracula boss fight yet, but like a lot of things in this game, it's also been my favorite. He does his usual bit of teleporting around and only has one health bar, but he goes through different phases throughout, starting with his classic triple fireballs, which will shoot up at you if you try to jump over them, flaming columns and ghostly fireballs that home in on you and quickly fall when you knock them out of the sky, making them a bit tricky to avoid. And his third and final phase has him casting Call Lightning as shocking pillars crash down on you. In between phases, he'll toss out a fireball that shoots in a circle, and destroying it will drop some food. Wall chicken tastes so much better when it's not from a wall, and being from a fire, it might actually be properly cooked. It's a fast-paced fight with some tricky things to dodge, but using your whip as a shield to stop the early fireballs, constantly moving, and maybe even staying your attacks long enough to eat some chicken, this is a very intense and really cool fight. But if you need a little extra nudge to help you out, a secret I had heard about before playing the game was the invisible staircase by the entrance to the level, where you're showered with power-ups to max you out. Full hearts, Morning Star, even a triple shot with the boomerang cross. The game is basically telling you it's the best sub-weapon, and I agree. It is still a Dracula fight though, so it might take a few tries to get down the patterns and finally put him back to bed. But as you enter the final phase of the fight, the music changes and Simon's theme starts to play. It's a real hype builder to push you into that final stretch. It's such a cool transition that gives you that push of confidence that you are the ultimate vampire hunter, and you're about to win. And win we eventually do, as we defeat Dracula and the sunlight bursts into the room, slowly destroying him, sticking the sun where it usually doesn't shine. Simon looks out at the crumbling castle as he has once again saved the world for the first time. Super Castlevania has been my favorite of the classic games so far without question. The art style, the tweaks to the gameplay that make it feel and flow better, and I do realize how that sounds. Castlevania becomes more fun when you remove its most annoying restrictive aspects. In the other games, the limitations of the whip and the usefulness of the sub-weapons were intentional, leaving a feeling of tension to the encounters and platforming. But the freedom you're given in 4 leads to so many cool moments of quickly dispatching Dracula's hordes and navigating his dangerous halls. The feeling of fear is replaced with a feeling of confidence, like you are what a Belmont is said to be in legends, a masterful hunter trained to slay monsters with ease and grace, the opposing force to the creatures of the night and to the Lord of Darkness that sits atop his castle waiting for a worthy opponent to end his reign of terror. And you are that worthy opponent. You always have been, even since before Dracula was resurrected. This may be a redo of Simon's first journey to face Dracula, but it feels like he's always been ready for this. Four down, 1 to go. We're finally on the last game of this retrospective, capping things off with Castlevania, Rondo of Dracula Blood X. Okay, it's really 2 games we have left because the history and release of what is effectively Castlevania 5 gets a bit weird. Rondo of Blood was originally released in late 1993, not on the Super Nintendo like the previous installment, but on the TurboGrafx-16, or PC Engine in America. I was unfamiliar with this system before making this video, but apparently this console with doofy spelling went neck and neck with the SNES and Sega Genesis back in the day, and with an add-on was the first games console that could play games on CDs. It did better in Japan than in North America, but it just didn't have the lasting game libraries of its competition. But what it did have was the next mainline Castlevania game, Rondo of Blood. The story begins with an evil priest named Shaft, and because his name implies that he's a dick, he orchestrates the resurrection of Dracula. In order to stop him once again, we are introduced to the next member of the beloved vampire hunting clan descended from Simon, Richter Belmont. He sets out as Belmonts always do, fist-pumpy walking to hunt down Dracula, who has also kidnapped several women during his siege, including Richter's girlfriend, Annette. Rondo of Blood was very well received and touted as possibly the best game in the series. One of the negative aspects brought up in a review was that it wasn't released in North America so more people could actually play it. The States wouldn't get to play as Richter until 1995, but not without some compromises. Rondo was just too big to fit on an SNES cartridge, so the game was effectively remade to fit on the system. Dracula X was roughly the same, but with redesigned levels and other changes to the presentation and gameplay. The reception was still mostly positive, but compared to Rondo of Blood, it was noticeably lacking. America wouldn't see the original game until 2007 with Dracula X Chronicles for the PSP, another remake of Rondo closer to the original, updated with 2.5D graphics, English translation, and a more fleshed out story. But if you still wanted to play the original PC Engine release, there was a full English port of it as an unlockable in-game, along with its sequel, Symphony of the Night. Both Rondo and Dracula X eventually made their way onto Wii and Wii U virtual consoles in early 2010s, but in the former's case, it was the untranslated Japanese version. And finally, they were re-released again. Rondo of Blood as part of Castlevania Requiem, released in 2018, and Dracula X on the Advance Collection in 2021 along some of the other Game Boy Advance games. So yeah, that's the truncated release history of Castlevania 5. Can I play the game now? I'm going to be playing both just to see the comparisons for myself, and I debated for a while on which one I should start with. Should I start with Castlevania Rob and see what the fuller experience was like first, or should I start with Castlevania DX to try the remixed adventure that would have been possible to play in my country first? I decided to start with Rondo. Since I've already been playing in release order, I might as well just keep doing that. Finally getting us into the game, we start it up and we get a cutscene showing us a sacrifice being performed that leads to Dracula's resurrection, and the rise of the Hellhold. There haven't been cutscenes like this before in the other games, and a few pop up in certain parts across the story and when you save one of the abducted women. When we make our file and start the game, we get a really cool cutscene that's like an anime opening, of monsters rising to attack the populace and capture Annette, as Richter arrives to fulfill his family destiny. The first level is a boss battle against death on your carriage, and it has voice acting. This is just the beginning, and it got me really excited for what was to come. Gameplay-wise, we have an interesting mix of Castlevania 1 simplicity with Castlevania 4 fluidity. Richter can only attack straight ahead like in the first games. No diagonals or floppy whips to be found, unfortunately. And you need to pull out your wallet to buy engagement rings for your jump arcs again, because you really can't adjust yourself in midair. Now that may sound like a downgrade compared to the controls of the last game, but it's really not. Don't get me wrong, I miss some of the extra functionality, but with some of Richter's other skills, you don't feel like you've been weakened. You may be back to committed jumping, but it doesn't feel as stiff as in the first couple games. It feels longer and more responsive even without the momentum control. And by quickly hitting jump twice, you can do a backflip, which is also good for covering larger gaps and for avoiding attacks in combat. It looks really cool, and flipping right over monsters or dodging boss attacks to lead you into your next strike feels awesome. The knockback feels a bit more reactive in a weird way. Sometimes I wasn't knocked back when being brushed by a smaller enemy, meanwhile bigger enemies will send you flying across the room, which hurts, but also gives you some distance to rethink your approach. There are no chain upgrades this time around, but your default weapon appears to be the Morningstar, so it's not like you have a handicap on your main attack, and it feels just as strong as the upgraded whips in the other game, albeit maybe a touch shorter. It may be controlled closer to Castlevania 1 through 3, but it feels more fluid and comfortable like Castlevania 4, even despite the lost whip versatility. But now that we don't have those extra functions to the base attack, sub-weapons become important again to make up for the restrictions. All the sub-weapons you know are back, but they work a little bit differently here. The axe is pretty much the same, being thrown in an arc, but they look bigger and fly faster. Daggers get thrown in a fan of 3 as a spread shot. Holy water is thrown sharply down at an angle and creates a short traveling line of fire on impact. The boomerang cross does a spin when it reaches the end of its range. I'm not sure if it's supposed to do extra damage if it spins on an enemy, but it feels like it should since you hit them at the perfect distance. The stopwatch slows down time instead of stopping it, but I like this better since you have markers that indicate how long it lasts. And going into witch time and flogging enemies in slow motion is cool. And a brand new item, the Holy Bible itself, or the Grimoire if you don't like the idea of the good book aiding you in slaying demons, for some reason. The book is good for crowd control as it flies around you in a growing circle. Double and triple shots don't drop as items anymore, but instead you get it as a passive ability for some items if you save up your hearts. You can also save up your hearts for an item crash. powerful super moves that can clear a room or deal massive damage, but cost 10 to 30 hearts depending on the sub-weapon, a concentrated barrage of knives, a spiraling explosion of axes, huge crucifixes flying in from under the screen to purge everything in their path. My favorite one is definitely the Holy Rain you call down with the water. It takes 20 hearts to use, but it's great against most bosses and can hit multiple times. They're the same sub-weapons we're used to by now, but with slight differences that not only make them useful again, but even stronger and more versatile in place of your whip. You still progress through the block as normal, going through the different stages that make up the level and end it with a boss fight, but you can find alternate routes within the stages to lead you to other bosses that will connect you to a different level path. In Stage 1, you can just go through the door here and continue onto the main path, and end the stage with a battle with a wyvern boss, leading you to main Stage 2 at a castle. Or you can break these conspicuous blocks to the left of that door, opening up a whole new path, where you drop down and face a plant monster and have a boss fight with a serpent skeleton on the bridge, leading you to alternate Stage 2 across a crumbling aqueduct, which also has branching paths. If you can cross the aqueduct without getting knocked off the ledges, you face off with the werewolf, who's the boss of main Stage 2, which brings you back to that route. Or if you happen to fall in the later parts of the stage, you just land in the lower section of the level, where you'll run into the bone golem and stay on the alternate path. There's a lot of zigzagging like this depending on how well you do in a level, or if you spot something out of place. A bunch of seemingly bottomless pits actually just bring you to other parts of the level, or can be used to your advantage to bypass some enemies. You're also not bound to the path you're on, because you can just quit the title and go to the stage selection, in order to replay levels you've finished and find a new path to walk. No annoying passwords to input, just a continuous save file that isn't affected by reverting to an earlier stage. Points net you extra lives like always, but they didn't feel as useful like they did in 4, so 1-ups were pretty rare for me. But money bags now have an additional use on top of netting you points. You also get currency depending on the type of bag, which you can spend on the boss demo menu to unlock videos showing you how to beat bosses without taking damage. At the very least, if you can't replicate them exactly, if you have the money, you can get some visual help on how to get past a boss you might be stuck on. Speaking of the bosses, they're also some of my favorites yet. There's a little build-up when you enter the arena as they appear in the background or posture for a few seconds. Like the werewolf rising up in the distant shadows and howling as he drops in and starts climbing on the walls and cannonballing all around the room. The bone golem as it rebuilds itself to go into its different phases. The Minotaur is a great boss fight to use backflips against, to either dodge halberd swings or soar over it as he dives in to gore you with its horns. And most bosses, even after death, will try to take you out with one last-ditch effort strike, which I don't think can actually kill you, so if you're cutting it close, your victory won't be snatched away from you, but it's still a really cool expressive way for a boss to go out on. One of my favorite boss details is when you fight Death properly on the haunted ship in Stage 5, where before he disrobes into his second phase, he spits out a tooth. Does working for Dracula include a dental plan? Let's break some more teeth and see what the premium cap is. There are so many great details because graphically it's a big step up even from Castlevania 4. Richter looks great in his blue outfit and white headband that make him stand out from the darker contrasting backgrounds. The sound is great between the music and the pain grunts of taking damage, and the moans and screams of enemies falling apart or deteriorating like in the last game are more overt and sound even better. The little background details and the more expressive animations add a lot when you notice them, like this caped figure in the background at the start of alternate Stage 3, which must be Alucard watching Richter's journey from a distance. Rondo of Blood looks great and feels great to play, but in keeping with the more traditional style of Castlevania, this is a really hard game. Not the hardest one so far, but unlike the others, I couldn't fall back on the save states to quickly retry tougher sections. All I had was my skill to rely on, which after so many of these games, it did help a bit, but not so much where I didn't get stuck on some parts. I spent over an hour on main stage 4 because there really were countless terrors in this trap-filled dungeon. Needing to duck under flails while dealing with other enemies, hard to avoid pressure plates that create more obstacles to deal with while platforming, and many axemen in most rooms. You fight them so much you can start reading what animations they do will lead into what attack, but despite that, I kept messing up against them, and one mistake usually cascaded into panic and more damage than necessary. And then there's 2 paths in the level that lead to different bosses. The first exit leads you to Dullahan, who's not terribly tough when you're not already running on fumes, but when I restarted the stage, I found a bomb that opened up another path to more axemen and eventually leads you to a fight with Carmilla, who's got a woman hostage in the room. I figured that boss would be more important since it's harder to get to, so I kept trying to get to it and finish the level that way. So after bumbling my way back to battle Carmilla, the woman there is so happy to be rescued that she embraces you, which makes you drop your hearts and holds you in place so you get caught up in Carmilla's exploding fireballs. If you haven't figured out she's not on your side yet, once Carmilla goes up in flames, you'll notice there's still health in the boss gauge, because this woman is actually a corset-wearing cat-eared vampire who will kung fu you to death while you're already exhausted. Her name is Laura, in case you were wondering. After several redos of the level and getting back up to Carmilla and Laura, I finally took them down and was able to move on to stage 5, which wasn't much easier. The stage itself isn't too bad, mainly lots of birds in the latter half, but the true fight against Death is really tough. He summons scythes like he does, then in his second phase he fights more aggressively and can even block your sub-weapons. After stage 5 we get a cutscene of Dracula trying to woo the captured Annette. She's resisting Dracula's offer of immortality as a vampire, but he philosophizes that there's really not a big divide between their kinds.
If my existence itself makes me savage, is that not the result of this world? Are not all the people of this age savages as well?
I've got a whole tangent about the cutscenes and cast, and we'll get to that later. Things didn't get much easier, but I want to bring special attention to stage 6, which is a boss rush of classic Castlevania staples. The giant bat, Medusa, the mummy, Frankenstein's monster, and then the Dark Wizard Shaft caps things off by smacking you with his balls. None of these bosses are too difficult on their own, but 5 of them consecutively with very little resources in between each fight is throwing a lot at you, and I really struggled here. After 30 minutes of attempts and still not being able to get my hands on Shaft, I had 2 options. Keep bashing my head against the wall and take another whip crack at it, or go back a few stages and get some help. We need to go back and get the big guns. A 12-year-old girl. Allow me to elaborate. If you go back and head into main stage 2, in that level you can find a key while being chased by this back-sideless monster. The key replaces your sub-weapon, but it won't have to for long, as you find a locked door to open, and inside you'll find one of Dracula's hostages, Maria Renard.
My name's Maria Renard. I heard all about you from Annette.
She's Annette's younger sister, and after saving her, she offers her aid in battling the horrifying creatures from hell. Richter just laughs her off, but he doesn't yet know the power that slumbers in that pink-clad huntress. You can now choose to play as Maria from the main menu. It's not like the partner system in the third game where you swap between them, but why would you need to play as Richter again when Maria turns out to be possibly the strongest playable character in the game so far? She may be small, but that actually works in her favor because she's short enough where certain attacks go completely over her head without even needing to duck. She moves faster than Richter and has a much higher jump, and then she one-ups him more by being able to double jump. She can even cartwheel and slide so you can move closer to the ground to avoid lower attacks or subvert some platforming. Her incredible mobility is also complemented by her basic attack, which has her tossing out birds in front of her. Their slight upward incline is great for taking out flying enemies, and even though they do the same amount of damage as Richter's whip, she can fire them twice as fast, and their little boomerang effect can make each one hit multiple times, making her damage output insane in the right position. In place of the bladed and religious-themed sub-weapons, Maria calls upon the aid of some animal friends so they can utterly devastate Dracula's minions together. A dragon that swoops across the screen dealing heavy damage, a cat that can run into the same enemy multiple times, a turtle that uses its shell to act as a shield, and while you move slowly and can't attack while it's on, it lasts for quite a while and makes you impervious to pretty much everything. And you can still use item crashes with them. And while there's a little redundancy between them of just flying across the screen to deal damage, they're all still very powerful. Yeah, sure, Richter's Holy Rain power is great and all, but it really can't compete with Maria's little bird friends, giving her the power to call upon a storm of phoenix flame, or summon a dragon that just wipes the screen clear. That one costs over 50 hearts to use, and while it's worth it for the devastation, I do not actually have footage of me doing it myself because it was such a steep cost, and the summons are so fun to use, I was very churlish with my hearts. Maria is great to play as, with her one big weakness being that she's a glass cannon, and can go down in fewer hits than Richter. With how high her damage output can be and her mobility to avoid damage, you can destroy everything in your path and avoid getting hurt, but if you get too cocky and die, it's going to be an awkward conversation to explain to Annette what happened to her sister. Speaking of Annette, I think we should really get around to saving her and the other girls. In stage 7, you get a key from a bird protecting her nest. So after killing a mother and scrambling her eggs for some health, later in the level, you find another locked door where Annette is.
The path up to here is safe. Now get going.
Richter! Wait! Richter! Come back.
Yeah, Richter, come back! It's definitely not safe back the way you came. Even if she can somehow climb back up and get past the harpies, the bridge outside collapsed. You just unlocked the door. She is far from safe. I died and I have to restart the stage. I suppose that means I have to bust Annette out again too. Oh, maybe not. I mean, considering what Maria can do, maybe Annette can take care of herself so long as there's not a locked door in the way. At the end of the stage, you get battered around by the ghost of Christmas Shaft, and once he's been exorcised, there's nothing between us and Dracula's surprisingly handsome face.
Wow, okay, yeah, he's pretty strong. Also really handsome. Like, why did none of you warn me he would be so handsome?
But is he stronger than you?
If he's as strong as he is handsome, then oh boy.
But before we do that, we should probably go save the other girls that were abducted first. They're both in hidden places on the alternate stage path. In alternate stage 3, almost immediately, there's blocks you can break that bring you to a stairway next to a skeleton. And down the stairs we find Tara, who thanks Richter for answering her prayers and wishes him well.
Richter, go with God's protection.
Then in alternate stage 4, right before the point of no return, you need to backtrack after hitting this frog statue to go down a path with fishmen and find Iris, who patches up your wounds.
That should do it.
Thank you.
Oh no, it's I who should be thanking you. Thank you very much.
After the cutscene, your health actually does get refilled, which is a pretty neat detail. Hey Tara, why didn't your prayers give me something as useful as that? Is God even hearing you right now? If you're playing as Maria and save the others, their dialogue doesn't change, but it's still Maria in the cutscene, which is fun.
Maria, I know God is watching over you.
Now, I want to highlight the cutscenes a little bit more and talk about the English voice acting. As mentioned earlier, the first real way to play Rondo of Blood in English was as an unlockable in its own remake, Dracula X Chronicles. According to what I could find, it seems that along with translating and dubbing the PSP game, the same voice talent was used for Rondo. So even though I couldn't find an English cast list for Rondo of Blood, as far as I can tell, it's the same cast as for Dracula X Chronicles, and the version of Rondo that's part of the Requiem collection is the unlockable version from the remake. Just trying to be accurate, but this seems to be the case. There are some big names here as well. David Vincent, who voices male Robin in Fire Emblem, and even reprised the role of Richter when he came to Smash Ultimate. Annette is voiced by Jessica Strauss, who is also the voice of Jury, one of my personal favorite Street Fighter characters. Michelle Ruff voices Maria, who is also known for Rukia in the Bleach anime, and Shinoa in some of the most underappreciated Castlevania games. Karen Strassman voices both Tara and Iris. She's also of Bleach and Castlevania fame as Soifon and Carmilla from Judgment. Tony Oliver is Shaft, who's been the English voice of Lupin III since the 90s. And the voice I immediately recognized, Patrick Seitz as Dracula. He also voiced Dracula in other Castlevania games like Judgment. It's just fitting that he got to voice a charming vampire lord, and then eventually went on to be the dub voice of Dio Brando from JoJo's Bizarre Adventures. And thinking about that overlap just made me laugh.
Tell me, to undo your injuries, how many innocent lives did you consume?
I don't know. How many loaves of bread have you eaten in your lifetime?
I wanted to bring this up because whenever I saw any discussion about the voice acting, it was always mockery at a handful of the deliveries and some of the audio quality. Admittedly, it does stand out as odd in places, but I'm assuming that's kind of intentional, to match with the cheesy voice acting of the time when Rondo first released, to match, say, the original voice acting of the follow-up to Rondo, Symphony of the Night, which was an unlockable in the PSP game and also redubbed.
Die, monster! You don't belong in this world.
It was not by my hand that I'm once again given flesh. I was called here by humans who wish to pay me tribute.
Dracula, die now and leave this world. You'll never belong here.
Oh, but this world invited me. Your own kind called me forth with praise and tribute.
Now, pointing that out isn't meant to be a dig at anyone, I'm just assuming that was the idea. I could be totally wrong, but even so, I just wanted to point out some of the amazing talent that's actually a part of this game.
Tribute? You steal men's souls and make them your slaves.
Perhaps the same could be said of all religions.
Also, another weird thing, the only cutscene that noticeably wasn't dubbed in English is the startup screen. Apparently it's from the German dub.
Dracula, der Fürst der Finsternis, Herr des Teufelsschlosses, ist auferstanden.
Out of curiosity, I did some digging and found the name of the actor, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Klaus-Dieter Klebsch, who seems to be a voice acting legend in Germany, being the voice of characters like Yami Merrick from Yu-Gi-Oh!, Don Carnage from Tailspin, Thanos in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, even particularly odd characters like Kui from Dragon Ball Z and the Boss Baby.
Ich regle das mit dem KIND.
Du kannst sprechen!
Gugu Gaga.
And to oddly bring things back full circle, he was also the German voice actor for Dracula in Netflix Castlevania.
Wir werden sie ausradieren aus unserem Land. Dafür werden wir weiterhin die Nachthorden nutzen. Alle Kreaturen des Terrors, die einst von der Menschheit fortgejagt wurden.
His filmography is massive, and a lot of the sources I found were incomplete. His behind the voice actors page needs some serious updating. Alright, I think we can leave that rabbit hole now, because it's time to take on Dracula. He does what he normally does.
They throwing the fireballs again.
Jump over his fire spread shot and duck under his dark inferno, and keep smacking him in his surprisingly detailed face.
I finally get to punch him! Right in his handsome face!
Why do you keep calling him handsome?
Because that jawline don't lie, and neither do I.
After his first health bar is gone, the world changes and he transforms into probably his most intimidating form yet. It's also one of his weakest forms. So long as you don't get pinned into a corner and don't be too far away when he fires off his lightning attack, it'll go fine. It took a little bit to find the perfect timing to dodge all of his attacks, but once again, we've fulfilled the Belmont clan's destiny. Dracula laments that the only reason he keeps returning is because humans keep resurrecting him in search of power, and effectively says that maybe even the Belmont clan may eventually fall to ruin, corrupted by their desire to grow stronger in order to defeat him. But Richter counters that the same desire could be used to make love prosper and supersede the desire for corrupting might.
It is by your desires that you humans prosper, and it is your faith which has ruled you. Considering that, can you really call me evil?
But people cannot be ruled by power alone. The sacred, the honorable, the loved, those things can rule humanity. Something evil will eventually fall to ruin!
Dracula even agrees that he may have a point, but is sure that they'll meet again soon enough to clash their wills once again. Oddly, the castle doesn't crumble like in the other games, and then Richter rides off into the new day to return to his loved ones and new friends. Finishing the game with Maria is pretty much the same, although there's a lot of weird pauses and cuts in Dracula's dialogue, but that doesn't really matter because we get the best exchange in the game.
Perhaps this, too, is part of my fate.
It's your fault for being so mean to everyone.
After that, Maria and her animal friends comedically make their escape from the collapsing castle, and she heads off accompanied by one of the chillest pieces of music in the series. This sounds like it should be played during a game of Limbo. Rondo of Blood is such a good entry in the series, advancing it forward while reeling it back to the gameplay of the earlier games without making it feel antiquated. Simply being able to select levels had me going back and replaying them multiple times for no other reason than to just keep playing the game and seeing where the new paths would lead me even after I had finished it. Maria is great to play as and adds this welcome dash of cuteness. Even her game over screen is adorable. And the voice acted cutscenes do add a little more personality to the characters than we've ever gotten before. Especially for Dracula, who's oddly sympathetic in this game. Like he would be content to just stay dead, but so long as he keeps getting resurrected, he's going to keep laying waste to the people of the world, because it's what they deserve if they keep giving him chances to destroy them.
It is not by my own power that I am resurrected. It is the greed of humanity which calls me back. And thus, by might, I rule. Might becomes the one and only justice in this world.
Of all the self-serving claptrap, the same basic fate drives all people to seek, to come together, to move forward. That surely can't be an evil thing.
Rondo of Blood is a big, replayable, fun game, and in comparison, Dracula X feels like a downgrade. Okay, now I recognize that's an excessively harsh thing to say about Dracula X. However, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this one. It's one thing to talk about similar games in a franchise continuously. It's another to talk about what's basically a reimagining of the same game. I'm not even going to give this its own script. This doesn't need a separate Google Doc. We have the same story starring Richter as he heads into Dracula's castle while searching for his kidnapped girlfriend Annette and her sister Maria. They're the only two to save this time around, and Maria isn't playable. Richter plays the same and still has the backflip and the altered sub-weapons and item crashes like in Rondo, minus the Holy Grimoire. And a great addition is dropping your previous sub-weapon when you pick up a new one, so you have a few seconds to make sure you don't lose the one you really want if you accidentally picked up the other item. This also happened in Rondo, but I completely forgot to mention it there, so I'm gonna bring it up here. The game begins in a burning village just like Rondo, but with a different layout and other interesting changes, like the behemoth chasing you right away and a boss fight with a Cerberus. After that, with some lip service to similar ideas in Rondo, the levels are completely different, and while most of it's still pretty good, a lot of the sections feel very similar to each other. Platforming with simple stony backgrounds with a handful of floating special platforms and flying enemies doing most of the work. And I know that sounds like a lot of areas in other Castlevania games, but here, very similar looking areas like this happen pretty frequently. Graphically, it still looks good, but I wouldn't say it's better than Castlevania 4. There are some pretty cool bosses like the Cloaked Sorcerer, who's very interesting and comes in 2 phases, but then there's fights like Death on a Clock Tower, where it's hard to avoid him or his sights because there's no platforms to use, and if Death hits you with his body, you are slowed down for a couple of seconds, making it even harder to dodge his attacks. I know I complained about some of the enemy placement in Rondo, but it's nothing compared to here, where you've got spear-wielding knights that block your sub-weapons, are hard to get close to without taking damage because of their reach, and often come in pairs so you can get stabbed through the floor while you're trying to focus on one. These hallways are so annoying and happen several times throughout. Dracula X gets a lot of praise as being one of the harder entries in the series, but at times it feels like Dracula's curse levels of unfair. There are still branching paths that lead to different levels and bosses, but I'm not encouraged to replay or experiment because I'd have to start the game from scratch. You only need to rescue Annette and Maria, but I've heard that's a bit of a nightmare before I even played the game. Needing to get through nearly 2 whole stages without dying once, so as to not lose the key you need to open their cells and pathways to them. I just decided I wasn't even gonna bother. I saved you 2 in another timeline, so I hope I can be forgiven for not saving you in this one. I took a break near the end of the game, so I had to input a password to get back to where I was, and the one I randomly pulled up online turned out to be one where you already saved Annette and Maria, so I still got the best ending. I take back what I said. I totally meant to rescue you 2 on purpose. The battle with Dracula is functionally the same as in Rondo, but now the arena is a bunch of uneven pillars with bottomless pits between them, so it's very easy to get knocked into them while struggling to get in a good position to even deal damage to Dracula as he teleports around the place. The best way to do this fight is to just load up on hearts in the run-up, stay in one spot, and throw axes. It takes a while and it isn't exciting, but it gets the job done. After his first health bar, he transforms and uses the same moves like in Rondo, but the form he takes is less intimidating and more domineering, if you catch my drift. All I could think about during this fight was that decade-old Dorkly bit.
Okay, so the safety word is Alucard.
It was here when I realized on accident that the Advanced Collection has a rewind feature. I like when collections like these have rewind as opposed to save states. I mean, it's good to have both, but the rewind is just more efficient. I really do not mean to come off as mostly negative with Dracula X, but all its best qualities, Rondo did better, and all its biggest problems are things Rondo didn't do. I just couldn't get into it, and I do recognize that could be this is the 6th game in a row of these in succession, so I'm getting a bit burnt out talking. But even still, I just couldn't work up the enthusiasm for it. Please understand, Dracula X is not a bad game. It just has the unfortunate position of being compared to Rondo of Blood and Super Castlevania 4. When compared to the former, it really brings into focus just how much had to be cut down in order to get it onto the SNES. And when compared to the latter, it just doesn't do anything interesting enough to advance the series forward and feel like a proper follow-up. I know Dracula X has its fans, and I am so sorry for coming down on it and only briefly touching upon it. But despite the blood it shares with Rondo, it's just not enough to quench the thirst. You know, when I decided I was going to make a video about classic Castlevania games, I thought it was going to be simpler. Not easy by any means, Editing a video like this never is, even with all the corners I obviously cut, but it was more complex than I expected it to be. Retro games that can be beaten in a few hours apiece with the same gameplay loop? Sure, that's no problem. Let's do 6 of these at once, because each one should only take like 5 minutes to talk about. Then I actually played the games, and some were a lot harder than I expected, and I played through each one at least twice. Then the actual nuances between each release made for a drastically different experience. The straightforwardness of the first game that was then drastically complicated by Simon's Quest, opening the world in an intimidating fashion. Dracula's Curse, despite being closer to the first game, gave you drastically different approaches depending on the partner you had, and then jacked up the difficulty, making the tension boil over. 4 amped up everything except for the difficulty, but it made for a more fluid and faster paced game, which I enjoyed more. And Rondo was a near perfect compromise of the early gameplay mixed with the newer sensibilities. And Dracula X is also here. Challenging, atmospheric, and influential. I can now appreciate just how much my current favorite games have been inspired by the early roots of this franchise. I suppose it would be fitting to end this off by giving a personal ranking of these games from my least to most favorite. Between the 6 games, I know what tiers they go in, but then it's a clash between 2 games in the top, middle, and bottom to decide what their order will be. Taking up the rear, I think this will be a controversial pick, but I'm afraid I'm gonna have to go with Dracula X. I cannot stress enough that I do not think this is a bad game. If you wanted Castlevania 4's graphical fidelity with the gameplay of the earlier games, it scratches that itch, but it felt lacking compared to Rondo. And even by its own merits without making that comparison, for one reason or another, it was just the one in the lineup I had the least amount of fun with. And yes, I am saying I had more fun with Castlevania 2 in comparison. Simon's Quest has its issues, and if I hadn't known what to expect and didn't know the answers to the obscure puzzles to keep the flow going, I probably would have hated it. But because I knew what to do to keep the pace from dropping and didn't get lost, I had fun with the atmosphere of the adventure. I enjoyed the gradual feeling of getting stronger and diving headfirst into danger. The manners were solid dungeons, and the brief moments of interconnectivity were really cool. It was a flawed quest that was held back further by its translation. If there was an official fix that was akin to that ROM hack, Simon's Quest Redaction, this could have been higher on the list, but in its garbled state, it hangs in the lower tier. In the middle, we have another clash between Castlevanias 1 and 3. The first game, despite being very frustrating in the latter half, it got a lot right the first time through, and is probably one of the more balanced games in the set. It still has its unfair moments, but they don't compare to the absurd difficulty of Dracula's Curse. The variety of gameplay the partner system brings adds a lot, and even if they're only minor, the branching level selection adds some changes depending on who you have with you. But the difficulty hike is so high, and there are spots that just feel unfair, and set you back way more than necessary. The characters from Dracula's Curse have gone on to be influential to the series as a whole, but keeping my biases of their other incarnations out of this, I think I'll have to put Dracula's Curse under Castlevania 1. And fighting for the top is the toughest one to decide. Super Castlevania 4 versus Rondo of Blood. 4 was just pure distilled fun for me without really any frustrating moments. It was one of the easier games to get through because of the flexibility of the whip and making it easier to hoard your hearts, but it was still so much fun and you felt so powerful. But even though Rondo balanced things back out, you still felt strong. And the balance of the first game is felt in full force with even greater sub-weapons. Maria is fun to play as and a great reward for exploring the stage thoroughly, and the brief moments to see more of the character's personality shine through in the cutscenes does add a lot for me. It's a tough decision, but I think Rondo of Blood is going to take the top. The replayability with the level selection and the bosses just barely edge it out over Castlevania 4. But even so, these two are easy to pick up, and I'm sure I'll be coming back to both of them as the years go on. Playing the mainline classic Castlevania games has been an insightful experience. It's recontextualized the other games in the series that I've played, and has shined a new light on how those series progressed on a mechanical level, and how the characters developed and were presented later on in the series. The Belmont clan lives on as a stable of video game vampire hunters, and are often referenced and have analogs in other games. Vampire Survivors, for example, has the first playable character wielding a whip, and most of the items and other characters you unlock and use are other references. Castlevania was the progenitor of many different genres. Dark Souls and Souls-like games that emphasize high difficulty and tension from brutal enemies that drain your resources as you make your way towards a boss fight. And of course, Metroidvanias that encourage exploration and experimentation with different equipable gear and ever-expanding mechanics that open up new doors in challenging areas. Classic Castlevania was the start of many things, and as the series continued to iterate, it was just going to improve on itself more and more. So, Why haven't we had a new Castlevania game in almost a decade? Metroidvanias are more popular than ever lately with games like Hollow Knight and Metroid Dread. So why haven't we seen one out of the Vania part of Metroidvania since Order of Ecclesia? Souls-likes have been on the rise for the last few years, so why haven't we come full circle with a Dark Souls-esque Castlevania game? There's kind of a blueprint for that with Darksiders 3. A whip serves as your main weapon that you can use to swing and platform with, and it did try to be Souls-like with a degree of attack delay and items needing a second to trigger when used. But also Darksiders 3 didn't really succeed in its attempt to be like Dark Souls, but that's another video. But my point being, it's kind of the closest thing to a Souls-like Castlevania game in a way. Make the character a Belmont and refine the Souls-like aspects, and that could be an interesting angle. But no, there's been no real Castlevania game in a long time. So what the hell happened? Well, Konami happened, and had been happening for a long time and is still happening now. As we progress further into the 2010s, we'd learn more about Konami and just how poorly the workforce and IPs were being treated for years. Going over Konami's history of abuse is a whole other video, and while most of these examples stem from 2015, there's no real inclination that things have gotten better at the company in the last couple of years. From the usual crunch of workers and poor management at the top, disrespect and erasure of their well-known talent such as Hideo Kojima, director of the Metal Gear Solid franchise who fought with the company just to keep his name in the credits of the Phantom Pain. Konami also apparently really hates the franchises that made it popular, like Silent Hill, losing the source code of some of the series' most popular games and then releasing a shoddy remaster collection, and then the removal of the PT demo from the PlayStation 4 store, which was a teaser for the next Silent Hill game, which was then also cancelled, and was also going to have Kojima working on it. And the next and currently last installment of the Metal Gear franchise that was released after Kojima left in 2015 was a garbage zombie survival game. And bringing things back to Castlevania, that franchise wasn't faring any better, as the director of the Metroidvania era of the series, Koji Igarashi, was also getting shafted by the company, passing over his ideas for Lords of Shadow, and he eventually left the company in 2014, which was also the year the last mainline Castlevania game released, Lords of Shadow 2. And look, even as a Lords of Shadow apologist and someone who was really excited for the sequel when it was announced, after seeing the reception, I didn't touch it until like earlier this year. And even though I haven't finished it, I was getting nothing out of the couple hours I played.
What is a man? But a miserable pile of secrets.
Hey, he said the thing! That doesn't mean anything in this context, so it's not even a good callback.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets.
Lords of Shadow 2 was poorly received by already irate fans and even the critics, and then Konami decided, since everyone was already pissed off at them for screwing over their own beloved franchises, that it was a good idea to use those IPs for branding pachinko machines, because that's what Silent Hill fans really wanted after the cancellation of a new entry in a beloved horror franchise, a gambling machine. And Castlevania got one too, and one of its selling points was, and I'm not even kidding, erotic violence.
No! None of that! Shame on you!
The cutscenes and promotional videos done for these machines actually look really good, like they should be trailers and scenes from a full game, but they're not, and it just kind of feels like a waste. Also, while I was in the middle of editing that, I found out that Lords of Shadow also had a slot machine, and it's got original characters and an all-new storyline? What the fuck? And I know Konami don't actually make the machines, they just license out the IPs, and I'm sure they're making more money off the gambling than actually releasing a game, yet none of that money seems to go to making the few games they do release any good, or to paying and treating their employees any better. And with the massive success of the Netflix show, you'd think Konami would have wanted to capitalize on it more and release a new game or something. But no. No new games from Castlevania since 2014. And don't try to be cute and say something like, well, what about Grimoire of Souls on iOS? What about Grimoire of Souls on iOS? Now I'll admit I'm being a bit petulant here. When it was first released, it was a freemium game with microtransactions that shut down less than a year after its beta release in Japan. I thought it wasn't even playable anymore, but it turns out it was released on Apple Arcade. And I did play it for a bit and it was actually kind of fun, but I just don't like playing games on my phone with my thumbs blocking a bunch of the screen. I'd probably be more interested in playing it if it was on Switch or something, but even so, it's not really that close to other Castlevania games. Basic platforming and live service mechanics that just make it a grind rather than a full experience. But even so, as far as Castlevania proper, outside of the re-release collections compiling some of the classic games and attempting to peddle worthless NFTs, it seems like the series, along with the other franchises Konami has the rights to, aren't coming back in any meaningful way. I guess that's just how things go sometimes, but there are plenty of other titles that fill the hole Castlevania left behind. As I've said too many times now, From Software's Dark Souls series and spin-offs do play off a similar feeling to classic Castlevania, and other Metroidvania games, including Metroid itself, having sporadic returns, along with other indie games that can also scratch the itch, including indie games by the former director of the more beloved Castlevania entries.
それで新しいプランを全世界のパブリッシャーにプレゼンしたわけです。ところがそれではビジネスにならないと言われました。納得がない。このビジョンを実現するには君たちの協力が必要なんだ。
After leaving Konami, Igarashi went to Kickstarter with a new studio, Artplay, and taking inspiration from Mighty No. 9 and Yooka-Laylee, crowdfunded a spiritual successor to Castlevania, Bloodstained: Ritual of the Night, released in mid-2019, which is a really good game that I highly recommend. It was one of my favorite games of that year, playing as our heroine Miriam as she traverses the Hellhole to stop her friend Jeebel's reign of destruction, finding new weapons and stealing powers from fallen enemies around the analog of Dracula's castle. It's Castlevania in all but name, with many subtle digs at Konami as a company, from bringing on voice actors from other Konami games to do ironic roles, like Alucard's original voice actor, Robert Belgrade, to voice an Alucard lookalike named OD, who hangs around in the library. David Hayter, voice of Solid Snake in almost every Metal Gear Solid game until he was replaced in The Phantom Pain, is now here voicing Zangetsu, an eye patch-wearing demon hunter. Hidden bosses ranging from gambling machines, which could be seen as a jab at Konami's propensity for pachinko, and the forgotten, rotting corpse of a figure that looks suspiciously like Simon Belmont. And even a game-spanning side quest where you avenge dead villagers, all named after characters from Castlevania games. Bloodstained is basically saying Castlevania has been murdered, and you can avenge them by playing this game. It had a rocky launch though, was a bit of a buggy mess on Switch, and updates for additional content were very delayed, but it captures the essence and fun of Symphony of the Night very well. But if you're looking for something closer to classic Castlevania, Artplay still has you covered, as one of the Kickstarter stretch goals was to develop an NES-style game set in the Bloodstained universe, which came to be Curse of the Moon, released in mid-2018, playing as the demon hunter Zangetsu as he sets off to destroy a powerful demon he sensed. Along the way, running into other characters like Miriam and Jeebel, where you can recruit them to help you in your journey, go it alone, or even kill them and absorb their powers. I loved Curse of the Moon when it came out. Despite my lack of experience with that style of game, it grabbed me in ways I didn't expect. The great pixel art, the fast and responsive gameplay, cool playable characters, and even cooler bosses. It was even in my video of top 5 games of 2018, which I highly recommend you do not watch because it's total garbage. Number 5, Bloodstained: Curse of the Moon. I have no nostalgia for classic Castlevania, but this game makes me feel like I do. But now, having played the games that Curse of the Moon was replicating, I now realize some of my favorite things about it were from those early Castlevania games. The partner system from Castlevania 3, recruiting new characters and their abilities being very similar to Trevor and Cruz. But in Curse of the Moon, the character switching is lightning fast, and you can have all 4 characters in the party at once, and their abilities can be used to find new routes through each level. And the bosses have death throws, like in Rondo of Blood, which I thought was such a great detail to cap off the awesome boss fights. The more you played, the more game modes you unlocked to get different endings. It didn't take long to beat, but I played through it like half a dozen times almost consecutively. Admittedly, I was playing on the casual mode because I couldn't stand playing on the default difficulty with the knockback and everything, but now going back to it, I actually kinda like playing with the classic restrictions. Curse of the Moon kind of is the best form of Castlevania 1 and 3, with a dash of 4 and Rondo in the mix. And then out of nowhere, a sequel came out in mid-2020, and even though Curse of the Moon 2 was just more of the same, it was still more Curse of the Moon. It didn't have the same magic as the first one for me, but it was still a close second, with even better character interactions and more to play as, being able to swap between 7 wildly different characters. It got a bit messy admittedly, but the level variety and multiple gameplay modes still made more of the same feel fresh, and the Corgi in the mech suit was the best character. To add insult to injury though, Curse of the Moon 2's reveal trailer came out just a few days after Konami announced Grimoire of Souls was originally shutting down. The spiritual successor to Castlevania surprised people with a new game on the way, after the original company announced that their latest Castlevania game was about to become unplayable. The timing is just funny is all I'm saying. But it's one thing to imitate the style of a game that people like. The real challenge is to take inspiration from one of the most disliked games in a series. And that's what Berserk Studio did with Infernax, which is like if you took Simon's Quest and The Adventure of Link, fused them together, and did everything they did wrong right, and then threw gallons of blood everywhere for good measure. You play as Alcidor, who returns from the Crusades to find his home has been overrun by Hellspawn. So you travel the land to find and kill powerful demons in order to open up the final keep, interacting with villagers to get quests to get money for new equipment, traversing difficult dungeons to find spells and abilities, and facing off with monsters and demons in bloody combat. There's a day and night cycle where enemies get stronger, but also some quests can only be done at night. You make choices along the way that affect the world and the abilities you're able to use. Are you a noble warrior who will protect and help those in need, purging the hordes of evil from the land? Or will you ignore the cries of the innocent and strive to bring chaos and destruction far more depraved than even the demons wrought? Multiple endings and playstyles dependent on your choices, challenging but fair difficulty curve, brutal and gruesome, but also funny with great homages to the absurdity of its inspirations. Infernax is one of my favorite releases of 2022, and the real reason I decided to make this video to check out the original Castlevania games. After finishing Infernax multiple times, I wanted more of its side-scrolling gameplay style, and where better to check than its very direct inspirations. And now having played those original Castlevania games, I now get more of the references in Infernax and appreciate it even more now. So the takeaway from this long-ass video about Castlevania games boils down to play Infernax. Why didn't I just make a video about that? In all seriousness, for many reasons, I'm glad I finally played through classic Castlevania. And I'm very interested in playing the other games in the series, like Bloodlines, the Game Boy games, and the other Metroidvania titles after Symphony of the Night. And to be fair, I wasn't that thorough in my playthrough of Symphony, and as much as I mentioned it, I really should replay that too. Castlevania turned out to be an important part of gaming history, and despite that, it seems like as a series, we're not going to get much more of it. There are rumors floating about of a new game maybe in the works, but knowing Konami, it's either another mobile game, something unlike anything the series has produced so far but not in a good way, or something that will just turn out bad in the end. But there's at least some good on the horizon. The Netflix show is continuing with Castlevania Nocturne, which is going to star Richter, so I'm excited to see where that goes. And even if we don't see more of Castlevania as a game series, there are plenty of indie developers out there that will refine and make the style of game their own. Ritual of the Night has a sequel in development, so we're at least getting more Castlevania in all but name. Maybe Castlevania will make a return someday, but even if it doesn't, like the Belmont clan, the teachings will be passed on, and the legacy will continue with a new generation.
The blood of Belmont has defeated me. It is not by my own power that I am resurrected. It is the greed of humanity which calls me back. It is by your desires that you humans prosper, and it is your faith which has ruled you. And thus, by might, I rule. Perhaps this, too, is part of my fate. Considering that, can you really call me evil?
The same basic faith drives all people to seek, to come together, to move forward. The sacred, the honorable, the loved, those things can rule humanity. That surely can't be an evil thing. Something evil will eventually fall to ruin!
We shall meet again, blood of Belmont!
What do you think? Like what you see, huh?
Hey, this is Timmara, and if you're listening to this bit, thank you for watching all the way to the end, and I hope you enjoyed this retrospective on classic Castlevania. Yeah, this was a big project to work on, maybe a bit too ambitious for someone like me. But yeah, just figured I'd do a little button, just like a little wrap up here, and just, you know, mention a couple of things. So yeah, first of all, want to thank a friend of mine who does not have a social media tag, and I don't want to dox him, but thank you to my friend who did the little Castlevania artwork that's going to be used as the thumbnail, the shown in the intro and the outro. Really appreciate it. Looks great, and it was really invigorating to see like a little just like a piece of art done for this, and that was very encouraging for working on the video. So yeah, just trying to, you know, quickly talk about the process, because this is I wanted to do a video kind of like this long video essay type thing, although it's not really, you know, video essay implies you had a point to it all. But no, seriously, I wanted to work on a video like kind of like this. I've had ideas for things like this for a while. I did not even feel too strongly about Castlevania as a series until I started working on this, and then after, you know, deciding I'm gonna do this because it should be a lot simpler than doing this Dark Souls video I had an idea for and was scripting for a couple of weeks, and that incomplete script came out to about 20,000 words. And I thought, you know what, maybe let's try something a little bit simpler. Let's try some retro games. And, you know, as I said in the outro, it was a lot more complicated than I thought. It was still fun, it was still interesting, and I learned a lot working on this. But yeah, it was a bit much. Trying to figure out what I'm doing with my microphone settings. I think I had everything set well enough. I changed a lot of my setup, and I was doing a lot more Let's Plays on this channel until I had some computer issues back in late mid 2021, and that just kind of stopped me in my tracks, and you know, not having that to keep me preoccupied kind of drove me a little insane. But no, everything worked out. Things are going all right. You know, life's a bit of a mess for various reasons, but we're here, and I was still able to get this project done. And you know, it's a lot of work, but very satisfying to see it come together in the end. So that's very nice to finally see get done. You know, if I work on another video, I've got a couple of ideas. I've laid out a couple of ideas in the video. You know, I could do Lords of Shadow. I could talk about, you know, other Metroidvanias like Symphony of the Night or Bloodstained or Infernax. You know, if you have it to suggest, if any particular option, you know, fancies your interest, you can leave a comment, talk about, you know, mention what you'd like to see, or other ideas you might recommend, a game to play or something to review, and yeah, just getting this big project, you know, off my shoulders. Maybe I can do something a little bit smaller. The next video I eventually do will not be this. I was thinking about, like, alright, let's go work on, you know, the Sonic and play, you know, 4 of those games back to back. No, I'm not gonna do that. Not right away. So yeah, thank you for watching the video. I probably got some just B-roll playing in the background just to accompany this voiceover. So yeah, thank you for sticking around and, you know, putting up with this long video if you did. Throughout the video, I'm probably gonna have like iCards of other videos I've done and, you know, other Let's Plays I've done. Nothing recently in a while. I got a bunch of stuff ready and I just have not uploaded it because I've been working on this, and just the other stuff I released recently have not really taken off, so I just kind of like never bothered, but I should really get to that. So maybe I'll do that eventually so this doesn't get drowned out by like literally 3 dozen uploads of other games. But you know, sorry past me, but it's me from the future to interrupt to add a couple of things. This thing is taking longer to upload than I wanted to, just because internet went out for a week and I was gonna re-record some sections and do some other things, but I couldn't do it with this voice. I don't know if you can actually hear it anymore, but after internet went down, immediately got sick. No correlation between the two, but I did feel unwell when internet stopped working for a few days. But also just to staple something onto here real quick, if you want to watch more Let's Plays and other stuff I've done on this channel, want to do more, I want to do a lot of bigger videos, and haven't done Let's Plays in a while, as I said, but you're on the channel, check stuff out, and if you want to support me in any other way, because I am not monetized because my channel is too small, but you can support me on Patreon with a $3 tier, only $3 tier, at the no tier, as I refer to it. But yeah, at Patreon, I'll probably put links to everything as I go, but patreon.com/Timmara, Timmara, and you can do the same on Ko-fi, and you can do the same on Ko-fi, Ko-fi.com/Timmara. Same spelling and everything. No financial backing is required or necessary or locks off stuff. I don't have that much to show off or gatekeep, so I'm not even gonna bother. So yeah, anything is appreciated if you can manage. I know we're still in hard times with COVID still absolutely happening, and people still recovering from that in more ways than one. If you can, if you want to, any support does help a lot. even if $1 on either of those things comes to me, I can rub that in my parents' face, say, see, I did make money off of doing all this. Doesn't matter how much, the fact is, I still made money from it. Thank you if you do, thank you if you don't. Just thank you for supporting the channel in any way, even if it's just by watching this video. I have nothing to add to that, so we're just gonna move on from there. Back to past me to wrap this up. But yeah, we'll wrap up here, so thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Like and subscribe and all that. This is Timmara, signing off.